Cool. So we can get started, man. I appreciate you coming on. This is a fairly new project, so it means a lot to have you kind of come on. Fairly short notice too. So I really do appreciate it.
Yeah, man, absolutely. Appreciate you having me on. I appreciate you guys doing this for sure.
Yeah, no problem. So really, with as much detail and depth as you're comfortable with, we can start with, where you grew up, what the family dynamic was like, and what specifically led you to the military.
Yeah, man. I grew up in a small town in Arizona. It was mostly just me and my mom growing up. My parents split when I was pretty young. I played a lot of sports growing up, and I think that was probably like a pretty good environment for some things that would come down the road. But it was I would say I was like a pretty normal kid. I when I got to be probably, I would say like a teenager, um, that small town probably wasn't the best, environment for me. So me and my friends got into some trouble, but um,
As you should.
yeah, yeah. I didn't really have, to be honest, man, I didn't really have like a lot of direction. I didn't really have a plan too much, and um, you know, I still have some friends back home that never really got out of that environment and got out of trouble. So I think honestly, the army was like a pretty good. Um, that was kind of my escape from that. So um,
Did you have anyone in your family serve in the military prior? Maybe in the army or even a different branch.
yeah, so both my parents actually met in the army, and so like they were. My dad was a mechanic, I believe, helicopter mechanic. My mom was as well. So like they met in AIT, and then you know started dating there. His orders, I think, changed at like kind of the last minute, so they ended up being stationed together, which obviously, glad and grateful for that. And but I never really considered it as an option for me for whatever reason. Um, and then, it was probably like I think senior year, and um, I'll be honest, man. Again, I never really planned on uh, joining the army. Like that was not. It was not necessarily intentional, and I always tell people that I joined the army on accident. um, but at the time, my girlfriend at the time, this is I think probably pretty early, maybe senior year. She had taken the ASVAB and scored pretty high on it. She was very intelligent, so she did pretty well. And we were kind of competitive um, on things like that, just like in good fun. And basically, she told me I couldn't beat her score. So um, I ended up going in. It was an excuse to kind of like miss class anyway. So they hosted it at our high school. So I took the ads out there. And to be honest, I totally forgot about it for like, probably a month or two. And then
Right.
I guess my huh?
Oh no, I was saying
Was
right.
that?
Sorry, go on.
Yeah. So like, yeah, like, a month or two later, I guess my results came in, and the recruiter calls me and he's like, "Hey, what's up, man? You want to know your score?" And I'm like, "Yeah, you know, um, for sure." He said I had to come in and talk to him to get it. So pretty smooth on his part. Um, so I go in there in like my, Obey t-shirt with like, I don't know, AK-47s or whatever on it, and my long skater hair and everything. And I'm like, hey, I'm just gonna hear this dude out, get my score and be done. And uh I think I left there like maybe like 4 hours later, just wondering how I was going to talk my mom into letting me join the army. So
Yeah, that recruiter probably went home and said, "Dang, I'm good."
yeah, he was very smooth. To his credit, you hear about, a lot of guys will say like, "Hey, I felt like maybe a little bit misled by my recruiter," or whatever. But that was not the case. He shot it pretty straight, and he told me what to expect. He told me, I mean, you know how it goes. He told me that the first couple of years could be kind of rough in the army. This is like 2007, so he told me the first couple of years could be rough, when you're like junior enlisted, learning the ropes, kind of like making a name for yourself, or I guess getting some rank, right? And but he was like, just hang in there and it'll be worth it. And he was right.
So at that point, with it being 2007, did the fact that the United States had been fighting the GWOT at that point for a couple years, did that kind of enter your consciousness at all? Is that something you thought about?
Yeah. So at the time, I would say I expected to go to Iraq, which actually didn't happen until much, much later, and really passing through there, obviously. But I considered it, I think a lot of guys kind of romanticize stuff like that. And, I was coming in obviously like on at the time, conventional like medic contract. And I imagined myself maybe like treating guys over there. I did pay attention to, the news as much as any, 17-year-old kid does, right? I think a major recruiting factor for like a lot of our generation was Black Hawk Down, to be honest. So I think I kind of envisioned it looking like that. And obviously that's like a pretty rare scenario, kind of a one-off. But yeah, I figured I'd probably end up going at some point.
To kind of follow on to that, you choosing the medical field, was that kind of as a result of the whole Black Hawk Down thing as well? Where did that kind of come out of?
Yeah, so when I came in, again, I didn't really have like much of a life plan. I was kind of winging it. I didn't have a whole lot of direction. And my grandma was a nurse. She was a critical care nurse. And I knew this is a very rare moment of, probably insightfulness or clarity for 17-year-old me, right? I knew that nurses or the medical field in general could make pretty good money. I knew that they could get a job pretty much anywhere. And I knew that it could be, relatively exciting. So I didn't have any necessarily affinity for medical stuff prior to that, but it was a pretty kind of calculated decision. And I just planned on doing 4 years and getting out and going to school to be like an RN or something like that. And they, here I am almost a decade and a half later. Somehow they kept roping me back in.
So keeping that in mind, what was that experience like, showing up to basic training, checking in, 30th AG? What was that whole experience like for you?
Yeah, have you been to 30th?
I haven't, no, but, the part of the guys that are on this podcast, some of them are in the military as well. So just, going off the stories you've
Yeah.
heard.
Yeah. So 30th AG was wild, man. I don't, I don't think that that's something that any average person really has an experience of, like that they can relate to before they come in, because it's just mind-numbing boredom, I think. And it has to be, especially at that time, that was during the surge. So, I mean, there was so many guys there. I remember at one point looking out over, I was like kind of on a hill, and I'm looking out over, they had like these big pavilions, whatever, that all the guys were staying on. There was so many dudes, and it was also a total rabble. I remember seeing guys in PTs with cowboy boots and like long hair with like one side shaved. It was just absolute anarchy there. But um, I think I was there for probably about 5 days. Um, got smoked some, didn't sleep much.
And
I remember,
not to interrupt you or anything, but for the
yeah,
listeners that maybe aren't familiar, would it be safe to say that 30th AG is kind of like the in processing, the reception, kind of before you actually start basic training?
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So, you're doing I think you probably get your ID card there. You get issued like your uniforms. You're doing probably some of your like insurance paperwork. I think there was maybe some financial stuff, just very standard, in processing type stuff. And you can be there for a couple days, like I was, or you can be there for a couple weeks, I think, which fortunately was not the case for me. I'll be honest, I would say if you had to choose, if you were giving me the option between, you know, going back to Afghanistan or going back to 30th AG, I'd probably pick Afghanistan in a heartbeat. So
Really, that bad, huh?
I think it was just so I think probably anybody can relate to this who's been in, reception battalion or whatever, is there was I think we would show up for breakfast pretty early in the morning. I think we would like come downstairs around 5:15, 5:30 and start lining up and probably get breakfast, I would say probably around 7. But that whole time you're just standing in a line. And I remember standing in lines, waiting. I mean, there's times where you're standing in line to stand in line. That's what you're waiting on. And I remember the door to the DFAC, like the dining facility, like kicking open. There was like a fan that would turn on, and then the guy who was leaving, exiting, would do so, and then the door would slam shut again, and then the next soldier would enter. And I remember hearing that sound hundreds of times, and it still keeps me up at night. So yeah, it was pretty. But I think they have it down to a total science. Obviously, like the people there, I mean, when you're getting your uniforms, you know how it goes. They can look at you and tell right away you are a medium regular, and then hand you that, and then you're out of there. So it was pretty smooth.
So how did that transition into actually starting basic training?
I think like any army school or unit, what have you, there tends to be a lot of rumors, and there was some rumors that we would be there for I think like a couple weeks. And fortunately, obviously, that wasn't the case. We got picked up on buses. And again, this was at this point, it was 2008. So things were a little bit different back then. So we showed up, they dropped us off at our, basic training battalion. And immediately they did the shark attack thing. So we're running around with duffel bags over our heads, and I don't think, my little barely 18-year-old noodle arms had ever held anything over my head like that before. And you're getting shouted at by the drills, and they have you playing all kinds of reindeer games, and then I was in basic in the summer in Fort Benning. So I remember basically like that was very new to me coming from Arizona. I had never struggled to just breathe the air before. It was like so thick, so humid. But yeah.
Is there anything else about basic training that you want to touch on? Was it a non-factor for you, or was it kind of a shock to your system? Seeing as you'd never really done anything like that before, I'm assuming.
Yeah, so I I actually liked basic. And I think probably a fair amount of guys feel that way looking back on, their experience. You learn a fair amount about yourself going through that. It's your first, for a lot of guys, it's your first introduction into that kind of environment, kind of testing your mettle a little bit and seeing kind of how you deal with maybe a little bit of adversity or a little bit of discomfort. I think as far as basic goes, overall it was a pretty good time. I will say, when I went through, we did CLS training. I think everybody does. But when I went through, that included doing IVs. And we had this, we had this kid in our platoon who was kind of a goober. And for whatever reason, we ended up getting paired up. And I mean, this kid was already ready to pass out like before we even started, but they have us in this big classroom. We're doing IVs on each other, and I get the constricting band in his arm. I get the needle in the vein, and for whatever reason, the drill who's watching us tells me to pull out, so I do. But he meant pull everything out, and I just pulled the needle out. So you got the catheter still in this kid's vein, and I mean his eyes were as big as dinner plates, man, and blood's kind of gushing all over the place. I felt terrible, but and I think he was like as wise as a sheep when that happened. But yeah, I think at the time, as somebody who was, obviously aspiring to be a medic, plan on becoming a medic, I was like, oh man, was this the right job for me? But
yeah, I can only imagine that'd be an interesting introduction to the career field you're hoping to go into.
Yeah. I was like, oh, did I make a mistake here? Basic, there was really good guys there. We had, I do remember one time, I was kind of gray manned it for the most part, laid kind of low, but there was one point where it was like probably a Sunday, so we didn't have like our usual drills with us. There's probably like only one on duty that day, but so we're going through the DFAC, we're eating whatever. At the time, like the big thing was, hey, make sure you finish you have to, if you had any kind of fluids, you had to finish them, right? And it was a Sunday, decided to treat myself a little bit, and so I got some chocolate milk, and the drill's like, hey, get up, get out, and trying to stick to that, I hammered that chocolate milk down, and he's like, hey, all right, man, I got something for you after this. And I guess that was not the right answer, so he ended up smoking my whole platoon pretty good, with me kind of in front of the platoon, just staying at attention, right? And had them all say, he would like smoke them for a while, and then he would have them stand at attention and say, thank you, private, and then go back to smoking them again. So
oh man,
that was pretty sweet. Yeah,
that's kind of a almost psychological side to it there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he was definitely good at what he did.
So if you're cool with us moving on, we can talk a bit about AIT and what that sort of entailed. You're the first person we've had on with a medical background. Everyone else we've had on so far has been kind of from that assaulter shooter community. So just going into AIT, what does that look like for 6-8 whiskey? And as for the time frame, are we coming up on 08 now? Is this still 07?
Yeah, so this is probably about, I actually graduated basic training on September 11th, 2008. Dang. So, yeah, so it's kind of cool, right? Like I think they went a little bit, they put a little bit more into like the ceremony and everything because of that. That was very cool. And, pretty much the next day we're on a flight to San Antonio, Texas, right? So the Army, I think most, if not all, of the branches now have their medic or whatever their version is training there at San Antonio at Joint Base Sam Houston. So at the time it was about 4 months long. You had an initial 8 weeks of like EMT training, like studying to get your EMT basic. And then the next 2 months after that were combat medic specific stuff and learning how to be a medic in a unit. And I had to, growing up, I was a pretty good student, but I didn't have to really try a whole lot. It was, to be honest, I think I was just one of those kids who was like good at reading. And so I had actually put forth a little bit of effort now because it was so new, learning that kind of stuff. And I would say I was a decent student, pretty average student, I guess, going through AIT. But I definitely enjoyed it a lot. And I enjoyed getting to work with my hands, with the patients and things like that, the casualties and some scenarios we did. You know, you know how it goes. You graduate basic training and you go to AIT and you've been, very isolated in a high stress environment for, a few months. And then now you go somewhere like San Antonio and you get a little bit more freedom. For us, we were able to go out like in town. We were able to go drink, wear civilian clothes, have phones, things like that. I would say like 3 days into our cycle. So there was a lot of freedom there. And it meant people were more motivated, but it also meant some people got themselves in some trouble, right? But AIT was a good time. I think that's where I, kind of going back to the basic training thing, I was still unsure if being a medic was for me, actually. I liked the pressure, but I still didn't like doing IVs to guys, things like that. I didn't really like, causing them pain, even if, necessary for the nature of the job, doing procedures and stuff like that. But San Antonio was a phenomenal time, and I still have friends from AIT out there still.
Did you notice a lot of TTPs and SOPs being passed down into the schoolhouse from what was actually going on in the GWOT during that time, from sustained combat in Iraq and Afghanistan? Were those lessons, kind of pushing their way down into the schoolhouse? How did that sort of work?
Yeah, absolutely. We had, especially at that point in time, right? I think you had a very combat experienced and seasoned force, and we had guys. So at the time we had they didn't have drill sergeants at the time. They had platoon sergeants who were mostly former drills, but they were, it was a little bit more. They were the ones who would take us around, manage day-to-day stuff outside of class. But they weren't, I would say, typically as aggressive as drills can be, right? It was a little bit more laid back for the most part. But, they were all E6s, E7s, and most of them had multiple deployments. And then you had instructors, obviously, who were very experienced. And man, I think there was an older civilian guy, and he was a Vietnam vet. And I don't want to speculate exactly what he did, but he was definitely a special operations guy from Vietnam. And just, I would say a lot of those instructors were phenomenal because they had that experience. And in fact, that older Vietnam vet guy ended up being one of the first persons to run me through a trauma lane. And I hadn't done anything like that yet. And my casualty scenario was essentially I had a a patient who I think he had like a leg amputation, and then also like basically his jaw was blown off. And that was kind of meant as a distracting wound. Obviously, the real thing there, if you follow your MAR sequence, the real thing is you should probably address that amputation first, right? That was the way it was in the scenario, was like that was an arterial bleed, and I needed to address that. And I saw that, I think this was my first scenario. I saw that lower jaw being blown off, and I totally fixated on that. And he just kind of stopped me, and he was like, "Hey, man, don't get distracted. Just take a breath, follow your march sequence, and you know what to do. You know what to do." So he kind of stopped me, and we reset, and it went fine. But I was very grateful for things like that, that you can't really put a price on that kind of experience. So
At that point, did it kind of hit you like, hey, I'm going to be doing this in real world settings? As soon as AIT is done with, I'm going to be out there, with the unit. Probably getting to do the stuff for real. At that realization kind of hit you yet?
yeah, I think I would say it's probably kind of in the back of a lot of young men's mind before they join, and even after, right? Guys who maybe haven't gotten the chance to deploy yet or what have you, or just in general. And I think this is kind of how maybe a lot of guys are called to the military, but you have that kind of voice or that inner thought that's like, how would I handle it if I was in one of those kind of situations? If I was in combat, how would I react? Would I be a stud or a dud, basically, right? And I think it's very similar for medics, just with that added, like, how will I handle it when I have my first casualty? Would I be able to do my job? Will I go into that, trained? Will that training kick in, and will I, be able to function, or will I kind of freak out? Will I get overwhelmed? So that's definitely when I started having, those thoughts. If they weren't there before, they were definitely there after that.
So, kind of going forward, finishing up AIT, where's your next assignment? Where does the Army take you as as you finish up AIT?
Yeah, so I ended up getting assigned to Fort Bragg. This was early 2009. I I remember showing up to, they had at the time like Fort Bragg reception or replacement, where everybody initially reported to. And my bags, one of the airlines had lost my bags coming in. So like my bag with all my uniforms, I don't know, that was, only God knows where that was at, right? So I showed up, everybody else is in their uniforms. I'm with a couple buddies from, I gone leave, gone back home, and then, we all met back up at Fort Bragg replacement, and they're all in uniforms, looking good and everything. And I have my, I think it was probably no Babe t-shirt, and like my, Abercrombie and Fitch or whatever, fur-lined hoodie on, and I got my sweet like DC loafers and my wolf belt buckle, and I'm showing up to Fort Bragg.
That's a warfighter right there.
Yeah, yeah. So there were some pretty cool smoke sessions that came out of that, I was definitely the odd man out in formation for a day or two, but yeah. So I showed up, and I think at the time we kind of joked that we all definitely wanted an infantry platoon, and I think a lot of young medics really want that, really aspire for that, right? If you consider yourself a combat medic, or you want to be a combat medic, like you probably want an infantry platoon as like your first assignment. And for me, so we felt that way, but we kind of joked about how it'd be nice to, be in an artillery battalion, because as we joke that we just be chilling the gun line the whole time. The 13 Bravos, whatever, be run their fire missions. We'd just be hanging out, in the shade in a chair kicked up. And
Playing spades.
maybe, yeah. And maybe I jinxed myself a little bit because that ended up being my first assignment was an artillery battalion. And, um, going back a little bit, so this is obviously post Airborne school, right? I left AIT, then gone to Airborne school, and then gone and reported to Bragg because I had an Airborne contract. But when I first, I'm sure you've heard this, it was true then, when you showed up to Airborne school, they would typically have like they'd pull the guys aside who had or wanted Ranger contracts, and they would, ask for volunteers, and then the Ranger cadre or representatives, whatever, would talk to guys for a little bit. And I went to that, and I was told that, I don't know how true this was, this is kind of surprising to me, but I was told that they weren't really looking for medics at the time. They were looking for, your truck drivers, your cooks, things like that. So I wasn't able to get a Ranger contract. And
Interesting.
yeah. And that was something I definitely wanted. So again, fast forward to, getting my initial orders. I was a little disappointed, I think, that I was going to an artillery battalion and not getting that infantry medic time. And obviously that ended up working out. I wouldn't change anything. That worked out. So,
talking about the 82nd, I know the Army places a pretty big emphasis on unit culture and unit pride. You have mechanized versus light versus striker. You have the 82nd, the 101st, 10th Mountain. Specifically, did you know anything about the history and the lineage of the 82nd? Other than the Airborne mission, do you feel like there's anything that sets apart the 82nd from the other units in the Army? Just what were your feelings about being assigned to that particular division?
I was pretty excited. So that was something that, my buddies and I, as we were, bouncing, you had that core group of guys from basic, maybe AIT, then, you're going to things like Airborne school, reporting your first unit. You get to know these guys, and you're, on the bus quite a bit, or waiting on chow, or, waiting to get issues, whatever. Right. So that was something that during those kind of lulls that we talked about quite a bit, is like where we were going and how we felt about it, what we wanted. And for me, I had kind of hoped to get Italy, I think. And there was a rumor that a fair amount of guys were going there. It's the 173rd. I had hoped this is basically how it went. And, I was, again, 18. I think a lot of us wanted the 173rd, not just because it was Italy, but because they had a cooler patch, So, but I was proud when I found out that I was going to the 82nd. I was excited. I was proud to have graduated Airborne school. I would say that have you been to Airborne school?
I have not.
No. So it's like the instructors there are, very good at what they do. But I forgot at the time it was like 3 weeks, and it was not my favorite school I've been to. I think that I was just ready to, get out of the planes and then get to my first unit. And I remember talking on the phone with my dad right before I was graduating Airborne school, and him saying to me, huh, like, I didn't think that you were going to make it. And I think that that gave me a lot of resolve to like see that through and to make sure that I did graduate airborne school. Um, but also gave me pride that I was doing that. I was doing something a little bit more, right? I had volunteered for like one more thing. I was doing something a little bit more. And I will say that if, you know, you hear a lot of people talk about um, airborne school, that mission, which I do feel like is, you know, pretty relevant, very relevant on a strategic level, but you have that mission. People kind of joke about it quite a bit, right? In the Army, when we're ribbing each other, like you said, you have the guys from different communities. But I think there's something to be said for a unit comprised largely of people who volunteered for at least one more thing, right? They, you know, everybody goes to basic, everybody goes to AIT. And, you know, is airborne school overly hard school? Not really, you know. It's not, I would not consider it either physically or mentally too demanding, but it's another thing that you have to volunteer for. And I think that almost works as like a little bit of a filter, right? To see who's willing to maybe test themselves, to volunteer for that thing, to go a little bit, do a little bit more, go a little bit extra. And so I think that there is some pride, and I say this as a guy who was never super into jumping while I was in the 82nd. But I think there is something to be said for that. So
Yeah, man. Going into it, you know, you're assigned to a artillery battalion. You said, where do you kind of fit in structure wise as the medic? What does the day to day kind of look like for you now as you're getting settled into the battalion? And you know, deployments, are they? Do you know if they're coming up? Are they? Is there a deployment schedule? What? How does that sort of work?
yeah, so I got there in early 2009, and that unit had got back from a deployment. I would say, I think they had got back roughly about a year and a half before I showed up. Actually, maybe a little bit less than that even. And so I was definitely one of the odd guys out because I was a new guy. I hadn't deployed. There was a lot of guys running around with, you know, deployment patches or whatever. And I was the only guy from my replacement group to get assigned to that unit. So I show up, I don't really know anybody. Um, right away, I will say that that medic platoon kind of, because you have that headquarters company that and that medic platoon there, they were very good to me. You know, kind of brought me in. They smoked me a little bit at first because I was the first 90s baby that had showed up. So I was the youngest by quite a bit. But, you know, once that was done, I think probably about 3 weeks, maybe a month after I showed up, we went to JRTC. And, you know, while I was there, we kind of had so I initially was supposed to be like a clinic medic, right? Which is not at all what I was really looking for.
Right.
Um, but I was fortunate enough to be around some experienced guys who were very willing to mentor me. My senior medic, I didn't really have I would say like my senior medic when I was in that clinic, I was kind of on my own really when I got to the line in a lot of ways. But that he was he had gotten a Bronze Star with Valor as like a E3 on that previous deployment. So
Wow.
I was, yeah. So you know, he had saved some guys even after getting like if I remember right, he had got like blown out of a truck, got knocked out briefly, and then saved those guys. So,
Where did
so I
they go on
had,
that previous deployment, if you know?
yeah, yeah. So they were in, I want to say mostly southern Afghanistan. Um, I think
Were they kind of doing that conventional artillery mission, or a lot of the times throughout the GWOT, you saw artillery battalions get pressed into services, provisional infantry battalions doing infantry tasks. Was that sort of what they were doing on that deployment?
that's so I think there was kind of a mix on their previous deployment, but on my two trips there with that unit, that is exactly what we ended up doing was, I mean, we didn't even bring the guns, right? Like,
Right.
so your whole, you would get certified on your artillery mission, but then you would go, um, right into training on those small unit tactics and on those, your infantry rifle platoon and squad tasks, right? And that was, exciting for me. I think when I got to JRTC, there was kind of, and how I became a line medic, there was like kind of like an incident with one of the company medics, or I guess battery medics. But so I ended up replacing him in that line battery. And at the time, again, it was you were training on like small unit tactics. They were doing convoys and things of that nature down there quite a bit. And so I ended up kind of getting that taste of what that was like being that infantry platoon medic. And we had this training exercise down there where there was like a mass casualty incident, and they were really, I think, testing like how the leadership elements in the battery handled that. But it was good training for me too. We talked a little bit about how I had some, apprehension maybe with being a medic after, some of those IVs not going well, just things like that, right? And not really having a huge taste for it. But that training exercise specifically down at JRTC, I think totally uh, eliminated any doubt that I had. I kind of had a trial by fire there where I had, to do probably about 20, you know, casualty assessments and IVs and um, different types of treatments and assessments and everything. And um, that that was very beneficial for me, and I think helped me find my place both as a medic and then in that role as a essentially an infantry platoon medic. And then and it kind of obviously endeared me to the guys, and like I was very grateful to have a great platoon. And then we deployed probably about, that was like spring-ish of 2009. I think we deployed about 6 months after that.
So, going into the deployment, are you aware at all of where you're going? You said this deployment was to Afghanistan.
Yeah, this is an Afghanistan trip. I knew, I'll be honest, man, I didn't know anything about Afghanistan going there. You got some good briefs going in, both, as we were kind of leaving Bragg and then when we first arrived in country, that I think were very enlightening. But I knew vaguely that we were going like, west, northwest, but that was about it. And I didn't really know, like a lot of guys, probably everybody, I didn't really know what to expect. And I definitely did not expect that to be as kinetic as it ended up being.
So, where were you guys based out of for that deployment? And what did the mission look like?
Yeah, so we were we were like out westish. So my my battery was assigned to Camp Todd, which was in a place called Bala Murghab or BMG. And we were like the first real significant. There had been Americans there before, but it was the Italians and the Spanish, I think, owned RC West at that time. And it was the first like real significant, I believe, US presence there. And so it was a very small camp. I think there was, I think we had 3 platoons there, and then another infantry platoon from, I want to say, 1508. But it was a pretty small group of guys, small camp. It was like us and primarily the Italians. And it was very, to be honest, it was a pretty, it was a cool environment. I mean, there was like nothing there, but it was, I think
Was
that,
the setup like at Fob Todd? I mean, at that point, you started to see a lot of, forward operating bases that were, fully developed with amenities. I mean, you had green beans, you had places to go get coffee.
yeah.
Did Todd kind of fall into that, or was it one of the more austere, bases kind of just out there in the middle of nowhere?
Yeah, definitely one of the more austere, man. We had, um, again, relatively small amount of guys. There was no electricity. Oh, there was a little bit limited electricity, but I don't think we had like any in our tent that we set up. There was, you were eating. I think maybe we got like one hot meal a day typically, but for the most part, it was like MREs and UGRAs, which is basically just a larger, you know, squad version of a MRE. Um, and for that first month or two, we were really just kind of set on building that place up and improving kind of our situation there. We, I remember our command team bought a cow, right? And the plan was they were gonna get this cow, slaughter it. They made the commander shoot it himself, which was awesome. Everybody came out and watched that. But that was gonna be like a treat for the guys, right? They'd bought it off some local or what have you. And of course, we slaughter this cow and find out that it was full of like worms or whatever. So, we went right back to eating MREs. That didn't last very long, but yeah, it was pretty austere. I mean, I think the only way they could really get supplies to us for the most part, at least initially, was with airdrops. So you would have, C-130s or C-17s flying over and kicking pallets out, and then we would go get them, which obviously led to kind of a change in our mission shortly after that.
So you can correct me if I'm wrong, but Bala Murghab, BMG, was the same place chronicled in that book by I believe Michael Golombeski, the MARSOC JTAC that was assigned to Marine Special Operations Team 82222. Was that sort of around the same time frame and location as your deployment?
Yeah, so I don't remember exactly when those guys showed up, but they did. They were based at Camp Todd, obviously, alongside us. They were in a different part. I mean, they were basically like, those guys were probably like, 100 feet from where we're at. And for my platoon, that ended up being, we ended up working with them quite a bit. We were, I think, kind of typically their hour cordon or, their QRF a lot of times. And so I went on multiple missions with them. And that kind of shaped, I think, seeing that, getting to work with them and seeing how they did things, we all kind of looked up to them, right? We were for the most part a lot of us were fairly young kids, late teens, early 20s, and these guys were all like a little bit older, a little bit more experienced. A lot of them have been former, I think, like recon guys, and so we kind of looked up to them for that experience and kind of the way they did things. And I think for me, that was the first real introduction or exposure to special operations and what that could entail. Working with their corpsmen, uh, planning with him a little bit for missions and things like that. Um, and then doing some of those more kinetic operations with them was like a really good experience for a lot of us.
All right, man. We're ready to get back into it if you are.
Cool. Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, just give me a second. I'm gonna get the audio rolling again, and we can start. So at that point, what did the day-to-day look like in Bala Murghab? What type of missions were you guys running? What was the situation with the Taliban?
So things hadn't really picked up yet. We were doing a lot of, again, like, base improvement type stuff. We would do like small patrols here and there, relatively near the camp. There was a river that kind of split the valley, the Murghab River, and on, I want to say, the west side was more coalition controlled, right? And there wasn't a whole lot over there. Whereas, excuse me, the east side was a more heavy Taliban presence. And as like kind of, I would say this is probably about September-ish, October-ish. Um, I don't know if you knew this, but BMG was like the Taliban like winter vacation spot. So they would kind of congregate there during the winter months and chill out, and then kind of disperse again, um, later on when things started to warm up a little bit, when fighting season came back around, and then they would head out back to wherever they came from. But initially, it was not very kinetic for us. Um, I don't think that we even really took contact at all until the day that we lost Islip and Sherman.
Right, and I know that had to have been a pretty noteworthy event for you. It would have been pretty surreal. So if you want to go into that day at all and kind of what your actions were and what the whole situation was and what eventually ended up happening on that day for you guys.
Yeah, so it was actually like I think, platoon's day to go get, they were airdropping stuff. We had like a small field outside, directly outside our front gate, right? So they would typically airdrop these pallets. We'd go collect them, and that could be anything from food to fuel, and it was my platoon's day, I guess, to go get these supplies, right? And typically pull security, and then you'd have other guys out there like wrangling the pallets and everything. And so we were waiting for this airdrop. It was me and some other guys just kind of hanging out, shooting the shit next to one of our gun trucks. We're all kitted up and everything. And I remember watching the plane fly over and thinking, when's it going to release the pallets? And then they went out, and it felt like they went out fairly late. And I'm not gonna speculate on like exactly what happened there. But either way, the pallets got pushed out, and the ended up on, I guess we'll call it the Taliban side of the river, right? So they drifted totally past Camp Todd, and for the most part landed on that eastern bank. And then I think there was a couple that landed either in the river itself or very close by. So we went out to get that stuff, obviously. And I remember, one or two of the more senior guys yelling, "Hey, get out there and go get those supplies," right? Because, the locals would probably come, snatch that stuff up if we didn't get to it quick enough. And I don't think we even knew at the time what was in those pallets. But so we go out there, and I remember driving down the road to the river and hearing, I think the driver, the TC, turns and looks at me and is like, "Hey, Doc, you got to get ready, man. Like somebody drowned in the river, and they're gonna need you down there." And so we kind of switched positions a little bit, and they started heading towards that specific spot. And we get down there, and they had already been swept in, obviously, by that point. So essentially what had happened was they were crossing the river to get some of these pallets and get to that side. They were mortarmen. So allegedly, what I heard later on was that they had their IOTBs, their body armor on, and then they would wear like a chest rig over that, and then just drop their chest rig and all their supplies on it. When they were in the mortar pit, lighten the load a little bit, which is, there's plenty of guys, plenty of TTPs who do that kind of thing, where they do wear some form of chest rig or harness over their body armor. And so that's what these guys were doing, allegedly. And, they got swept into the water. The river was pretty treacherous, because there's parts where, you could be like knee or hip deep. And then, I would say 20 feet downstream, it would be like a 50-foot depth, right? So they got swept in, and one tried to save the other and couldn't. And these guys ended up, it was cold, fast moving water. And they got, pulled under by their kid. They couldn't get their kid off, allegedly. And so they ended up both drowning. And for that day, we were obviously looking for them, trying to find them. It was anarchy, right? Everybody was scrambling to get down there and help out. So you had guys around like me in full kit, and then you had other guys with absolutely nothing, totally slick, maybe a rifle, who were running around trying to help find these guys. And there was like, at one point, stuff like this seems to happen in combat or on deployments and things like that, where it's like almost like a game of telephone, right? And some call came over the radio saying that they had found a body, but it was Italian on like downstream, and which obviously wasn't true. I have no idea where that even came from, but
Right.
we're gonna go check it out. So myself and two of my NCOs at the time end up running down that western bank, and we tried to get to where they said this person allegedly was at. And again, there ended up that not being the case. There was nobody washed ashore, but at the time, the fire got so thick that we really couldn't we really couldn't continue. So the Taliban, while this is going on, had seen all this activity and thought that we were launching an operation and we were trying to take ground and take territory over there. So
Right, because from their
they
perspective, it looks like an offensive with all these different units and agencies gathered.
exactly right. So um, they saw this activity and they set up a PCAM position. Had some guys, I guess, with like RPGs show up. And I remember seeing those RPGs streak by initially and hearing that fire pick up. I'd never been shot at until that point, and thinking like, man, this is getting pretty thick. But I didn't really know what we were. I didn't really understand probably how thick it was until I started looking at the guys next to me and seeing like, oh yeah, this is legit. Seeing their reactions from these guys who are more experienced, and so they're like, hey, we can't keep pushing. There's only 3 of us, so we ended up turning back and joining up with the rest of the element, and we spent probably the next, I don't know, 5 hours roughly, searching for these guys while we were getting shot at. And I mean, I spent, hours, a lot of us just laying in the prone that day, pinned down by, I think, that PCAM position, or at least it felt like hours, and that search for those guys ended up taking, I would say, at least a few weeks after that. And that changed like the whole nature of that deployment for everybody.
Was the rest of the mission kind of like the same way as well, where you guys were going out, taking contact, and was it kinetic the whole way through?
For that specific day?
Just the whole event in general, recovering the bodies.
Yeah, so we spent, all day into the night on that river looking for these guys. And they ended up taking my platoon. And, once we were able to engage and kind of, kill or suppress that Taliban position, they took my platoon and flexed us to a site, an A&A site that was like, maybe a mile or so down the river, maybe a little bit less than that. And the intent there was just for us to kind of watch that river and see if anything or anybody ended up getting swept downstream past us. And, maybe we could, at that point, you have missing personnel and you're hoping it's not the worst case scenario, but obviously you have to prepare for that. So we were hoping to at least, recover them if they ended up washing downriver. And I think they told us that we were going to be there for, 6 hours or something like that. And we didn't leave until like 45 days later. So we were there for quite a while. They ended up bringing in divers. I think they brought in PJs. They brought in, I think, some Brits who were maybe dive qualified. They ended up setting like a net actually in the river itself to try to catch anything that washed through. Gear, potentially body, whatever. And then obviously they had search operations going on in other parts of the valley as well. It was constant. And I would say probably about 2 weeks in, they found one of them. And again, I wasn't there, but allegedly he had been kind of washed ashore, and some of the locals ended up passing that information to us so that we could come get him. And then I believe 3 weeks, maybe a month later, they ended up recovering the second soldier. And I think it was Navy divers who came out and actually did that and found him submerged. Yeah.
So can you get a bit into the events of March 3rd and what that sort of entailed for you guys as far as treating casualties and the whole medical aspect of your job?
Yeah, absolutely. So you talking about my first experience stream casualties?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that was March 1st, 2010, and that was, at that point we were pretty, I would say, we had a fair amount of combat experience in that platoon. You had guys had set up some OPs like Pathfinder and things like that, which I think that's in Level Zero Heroes, those books as well. But so we had set up some OPs. We had been pretty consistently engaged. Obviously, things changed pretty dramatically. The nature of our mission changed pretty hard after we lost those two guys, and so we had again a fair amount of combat experience, I think, and kicking around. So that day was basically they had discovered a couple IEDs, I believe, that were in place like near a bridge, and to kind of free up, I think, movement for us, but also the civilian population. The mission was going to be that some EOD guys were going to go engage, interdict these IEDs, clear them out of there. You had ANA there as well, and then you had like two platoons of infantry, I guess, artillery guys. Like my platoon was there, and it was, to be honest, I totally expected it to be very chill, very mellow day. I don't think, compared to some of the other missions that we run up to that point, it wasn't. It didn't really raise any flags, obviously, but so we're kind of hanging out by the gun trucks on the road while the EOD guys are doing their thing, and then you hear one blast and then a second, and then obviously the fire. You hear a machine gun position opens up, and what the Taliban had done is seen the EOD guys moving in, blown their IEDs to try to get either those EOD guys or their little robot Markbot thing that they use, and then maybe produce some casualties. I think they were actually trying to capture that bot as well. But anyway, so firefight kicks off. My platoon flexed kind of around, so you had a large open field with a village on the back end, which is where that Taliban position was at. And then on the side of that village and that field was some foothills, essentially. And so we flexed our gun trucks over on top of those hills, looking down into that Taliban position, and started engaging them, opening up. At the same time, one of our sister platoons, some infantry guys, ended up kicking dudes out to, I don't know what the intent was there, but they ended up in that open field, and it was a weapons squad. So you had like a SAW gunner, you had a 240, you had I think the Fort Observer was with them as well, and so they started getting engaged by that Taliban PKM position like immediately. And there was in this field, they just got caught basically in the open. I mean, there was if you ever have seen like a tilled up field, like farmer's field, that's what they were working with essentially. So my platoon gets to the top of these hills. I hop out. I don't know what's going on, but we had RPL was a former enlisted SOF guy, and all around great dude. Still love him to this day. And he was always, you want to be next to him because that's where the action was going to be. right? He was going to find a way to get in there somehow. So I end up jumping out of the truck and running over to him. I'm like, hey, man, what's up? Like, what's the plan? And he looks at me and he's got a very uncharacteristically serious face. And he says, hey, man, there's one wounded in action and one KIA, one killed in action down that field, and we're going to go get them. And I'm like, all right, let's do it. So he and I run down this field, or run down these hills. There was like a slight bit of cover, and we took a second there, took a little pause, and then basically sprinted out to this weapon squad in this field to go recover their casualties and help them out. And I this is probably the smoothest thing that I've ever done in my life. So we're running out to his position, and he had accidentally hit somehow the mag release on his M4, and so his full mag dropped in the field as we're running, and he notices it and he keeps going. He maybe slow down a little bit, but basically full sprint. I reach down and I pick up that mag and I throw it to him, and he catches it full. He catches it full sprint and throws it back in, and then we make 10 position. And that was, I don't know if I could replicate that again, to be honest. But yeah.
No, I was just saying that's insane. Fucking Jason Bourne over here.
Yeah. 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 It was like full sprint. It was just one of those moments where you got a lot going on, but in your head, you're like, okay, that was kind of cool.
How old are you at this point?
I was 19. I was
19. And maybe it didn't hit you in the moment, but maybe afterwards or something. Did it ever kind of occur to you that, hey, I'm doing the kinds of things that most Americans my age will never get the experience, will never get to see?
Yeah, I think I felt a little bit different. I think so. That was a year-long deployment, and we had taken I had taken mid tour about 6 months in, which ended up being probably about like December or January, probably like January. So I had gotten to go back home and then go visit my family in California as well, and see talk with some of my friends from high school, and be back around them for about a week or two before I came back to Afghanistan. And that was, I think that started to open my eyes a little bit to how unique some of these experiences could be compared to like where a lot of people I grew up with were at. But I think it really hit me obviously after this day specifically.
That's got to be surreal. So, going back to March 1st, what happens once you get to the actual site of the casualties?
So we get there, and my PL, he goes to the first guy, first casualty we come across, right? And I keep going, probably about, I would say 10 yards away or so was the second one. And essentially, they were 240 gunner and I believe AAG, and this Taliban position had opened up, and each one of them ended up taking a round to the head. And so initially it'd be called up as a WIA and a KIA, but they're actually still both wounded. Neither one had passed yet. So we get there. He starts working on one casualty. I get to the second, and it was pretty chaotic. You had a lot of the guys from that squad, I think, were kind of checked out, and so there wasn't a whole lot of, I would say, and I'm not trying to judge anybody here or anything like that, but it didn't seem like there was a whole lot of command and control going on. It didn't seem like there was, there was they weren't engaging much. I know the FO was calling up a fire mission at that point, but it was these guys were, for the lack of a better term, pretty shell shocked, I think, by having two of their guys get hit like that. And so I get to that first casualty, and he was still breathing. His eyes were still open, but you can tell right away that he was not in good shape. The respirations were kind of off. They didn't sound right. The rate was not right. They were kind of like almost like gasping or sighing breaths. His skin was very like clammy and very pale looking. And again, his eyes were open, but they were just fixed on, who knows what. He was staring off basically, and obviously he was nonverbal, really. And I sit him up, and I see that he's taken around basically behind his left temple, and then out behind his ear, like between basically the back of his ear and the kind of that knot on the back of your head. And so it exited right there. So, I mean, I can see exposed brain matter, all that stuff. And I remember talking to my dad before deployment, and him asking me if I was, as I was getting ready. And I remember him asking me, hey, is there anything you're concerned about? And he had deployed before and everything. And I was like, I really just don't want to. I was like, there's three types of casualties, they say. There are the ones who are going to be, there's going to be the guys who are fine no matter what you do. There's going to be the guys who are not going to be savable. They're going to be no matter what you do. And then there are the guys who, if you do the right treatments, the right time, and you're on it, they'll make it. You can save them. And I told him what I was concerned about was really the second category, was the guys who, I wouldn't be able to save. And I anticipated that would be pretty hard. I was like, hey, I just don't want those. And he was like, you should get ready, because there's a very real chance that you could have that. And he was right, So I get to this first casualty, and I realized pretty immediately that he's expectant, right? He could probably have this injury pattern. He could have got shot like that in an OR, probably at the finest, level 1 trauma center in the US, and he's probably not going to make it. But so I just went to work, really, and I started wrapping his head, checking for other stuff that was going on, any other injuries. I'm talking to the FO, and I didn't really want to distract him from his job, from working that fire mission, because obviously that could be, that's obviously key, right? Is him being able to do that and potentially save us if he can put rounds on that PCAM position. So I didn't want to pull him away from that too much, but I'm just kind of talking to him, checking on him, making sure he's good, and then really working on my casualty, getting his wounds dressed. And, I had him for a couple minutes, and I remember thinking, man, like, these guys just got shot right where I'm kneeling. And that next round, the next burst, one of those bullets could have my name on it. And I could be, it's very likely, that I could end up eating the next round. And if you're familiar with TCCC at all, Tactical Combat Casualty Care, you are initially supposed to grab the casualty and then just kind of bounce in that care under fire phase. maybe throw in a tourniquet if it's needed,
Right.
but you know, get to cover, get to safety, right? Because you're no good to anybody as a medic if you get popped. But for me, and I felt like there was a couple lessons that came out of this for me for sure. But there was no way that I was going to be able to move these guys on my own um, and get to cover without really probably increasing my risk of getting shot, right? If I was to like, firemen's carry one of these dudes or whatever, I mean, they're 220 pounds with kit, maybe 250, right? So they're big boys. So moving them on my own, it's not gonna happen quickly. The other guys, I don't necessarily want to pull them away because they're trying to get them that 240 up. They're working on a fire mission, things like that, right? So, I made the decision to stay, and an ideal decision, but it was kind of the one I had at that point in time. I was measuring the risk there, but also, hey, if I leave and then one of these guys gets hit, you know,
So at this
it's going to be
point,
more difficult.
being the junior medic, do you have guys that are checking in on you, or are you the only form of medical healthcare specialist on the scene? Are you the only medic that's there?
Yeah, it was at that point, it was just me. So you had their platoon medic, who is a great dude. Um, and I ended up talking to him quite a bit. And we actually I didn't really know him much before this. Excuse me. We ended up kind of bonding afterwards, obviously. Great guy. He and his element were not able to get there. They were pinned down. It would have been even more risky for them to try to get to us. So, yeah, it was just me. I had, fortunately, a CLS guy show up. And I can't say enough about the value of, your combat lifesavers or your Ranger first responders, guys like that, how important it is to do that cross training. But unfortunately, this guy who was like an infantry sergeant who showed up had been trained up very well by their platoon medic, but he got to us probably, I would say, 10, 15 minutes into this and started helping me treat and move these guys. And then shortly after that, actually, we had some Italians show up as well. But yeah, we moved these guys. I was the only guy there on scene for a little bit, and we moved them to the side of the field once we had enough guys show up, and were able to put them in the back of A&A, like those Ford Rangers that they used to pop around in. So we got in the back of those, and then we had both casualties consolidated there, and that was my first chance to get a look at that second casualty.
And what was the situation around the second casualty?
So with him, I didn't realize it till a little bit later, but he had been shot in the face, basically under his eye, and that round had not exited. So his face is very swollen. There's lots of blood and discharge, mucus, things like that. Um, he had almost like his breathing was almost like snoring respirations, right? So I sat him up immediately, started checking him, and realized that he too was obviously in pretty bad shape. And pretty immediately, we got these guys in the truck and then started pushing to another objective that was, I would say, probably a mile or two down the road, which was actually their platoon OP, right? So like their platoon compound. And our, we had A&A guys that we driving the truck. So me and this infantry dude in the back of the truck treating these two casualties, taking a look at them. And we ended up pushing down the road to that compound. I actually didn't have my aid bag on me. So I when we myself and my PL ran down the hill, I chose not to bring that with me because I left it in the truck because I figured we would be able to move them back. So I didn't think that we'd end up hanging down there as long as we did, and I figured that we'd be able to flex the trucks to us. But and I didn't really want it slowing me down, to be honest. I didn't want to run out there with a big aid bag and draw this attention to myself, slow me down, and potentially risk getting
Right.
shot. So um, unfortunately, they ended up flexing those trucks to another position just a couple minutes later. So I'm without my aid bag. So I had some initial life saving stuff on my kit, a few pouches with like that massive hemorrhage stuff, airway, respiratory stuff, and then some IV resuscitation stuff on my kit. But I didn't have my full aid bag. So as we're getting to the compound, once we get there, I'm scrounging up, the CLS bags, aid litter kits, pretty much anything I can get my hands on to treat these guys. And so getting to that compound, it's pandemonium in there, obviously. Those guys, we just show up with two of their guys who are, grievously injured and expectant. So, you have guys running around screaming to cover them up. You have guys who are crying. I'm working on the second casualty and just trying to initially assess him and see what his injuries are, what I'm working with. And one of the guys from that platoon runs up and starts talking about their wives and hanging out and how his wife missed him and things like that. And how he needed to hang on for her, right? And I had one of the other guys basically come get him and escort him away so I could focus on what I was doing because that was not easy to be dealing with or to hear at that point in time. It wasn't, good for him either.
Right.
So, so I started assessing him and, realized what his injuries were. And the right answer as a medic is rarely, if ever, to do nothing. Right. So I decided that, hey, it was indicated based on his injuries. And, hey, I needed to, his breathing wasn't what it should be. I couldn't get like, the right answer was to do something. And the something that I decided on was a surgical cricothyroidotomy or a surgical airway. So I ended up doing that. Ended up being more difficult, I think, than I expected at the time. But I got that airway in, and then right as I got that airway in and got secured, that's when the Blackhawks showed up. So we were able to get those guys out of there. Do the handoff to that flight crew, which was terrible. This is probably not very surprising, but you can shout all you want under Blackhawk when it's running. They ain't gonna hear a thing. So I didn't have much in the way of a T-CCC card or what have you there. We were very fortunate because we were, maybe like a 5-minute flight or what have you from Camp Todd, and there was actually Blackhawks stationed there at Todd. So they and then half of a 4 surgical team. So those guys got to us very quick, and that was one of the nice things I would say about the GWOT as a whole is those quick evac times. But they showed up before I even knew they were in the air, and so I was able to get that airway done, get those casualties handed off to the flight medic with a lot of pointing and charades, and they evac'd them. And I think I was kind of that was the first time that right after that happened, or if they took them, I was able to take a breath, and I think that's when things kind of my mind started to catch up.
Yeah, I mean, I can only imagine how frustrating that would have been, to have were these your first two casualties that you treated at that point?
Yeah, I done little stuff helping out in the aid station on Todd, but I had not had any casualties of my own, and definitely nothing serious like that at that point. So yeah, definitely kind of got thrown into the fire pretty early on.
So, not to speak for you, but I can only then imagine that that must have been pretty formative as for, lessons learned and, going forward, how you treated situations on, the rest of your career. Did you find yourself kind of looking back to that, referencing that incident, as your career went on and you encountered different situations?
Man, absolutely. I think that really that incident and really that deployment as a whole, just the nature of it. I was very that I would say that shaped my philosophy in a lot of ways. As not just like, I was a teenager, so a teenager becoming a man, but also as a soldier, that really shaped my personal philosophy on the things that mattered um, in the military, how to train your guys, what training should look like, what preparing for things should look like, uh, and really that kind of determined. I was like, hey, like from that point in my career, I was like, okay, there's situations like this going on, throughout the GWOT, even obviously you're back at home sitting on the bench basically, right, in garrison, coming home from a deployment, waiting for the next one or whatever. That for me was like, I don't want to be in those situations. I want to be where the hurt guys are. I want to be on the forefront. I want to be at that point of injury, and that for me, especially at that point in my career, everything became about that, training for that, preparing for that. So
So, going forward, how did the rest of that deployment close out? Was it still pretty kinetic towards the end, or, would you say that things kind of softened up a little bit after, your guys' efforts?
yeah, man, I stayed very kinetic. I would say that whole deployment, and we were so my platoon was probably about, I say platoon, but it was like, I think at most we had like 15 guys. It was a very small platoon, but
Yeah, I mean,
uh,
that's pretty much like a squad plus.
yeah, yeah. But you had some great guys, and I think again a lot of us kind of had that trial by fire experience, and we had phenomenal leadership, and so we kind of ended up getting a fair amount of the more, if it was a more kinetic mission or had the potential to be, like it kind of fell to us, right? Especially if that like involved, supporting that those TF 8222 guys, supporting, their platoon, right? Working with those guys as QRF outer cordon. Um, like they had a like there was one casualty they took, we responded to and kind of helped enable his evacuation, and it I would say it was pretty kinetic up until we left um, later that year, and um, that was a very very valuable experience for me and for us, I think, and it was rewarding because you could look out, you whatever OP, whatever hill you happen to be on at that point in the deployment, you could look out and see miles where coalition forces, us and the ANA, the Italians, Spanish, had cleared out these huge portions of land from Taliban and pushed those guys out of there. So, we're producing significant amounts of Taliban casualties. We were taking the ground. You had a lot more freedom of movement for both the civilians and the ANA. And I think that was very satisfying for us to be able to see kind of the fruits of our labor there and how that hard work had paid off, you know.
So coming back from that deployment, when do you start to hear about, the special operations side about it? When does the idea of being a special operations combat medic kind of enter your worldview after being in the Army for a bit, getting a deployment under your belt?
Yeah, man. So we came back. It was late 2010, and my ETS date was supposed to be in 2012, and that's when I was supposed to get out of the Army. And I hadn't really decided what I wanted to do yet. I I ended up, so we ended up coming down orders for another deployment in early 2012, this time to Kandahar province. And excuse me, they moved my ETS date like to the left. I think they were trying to clear us out of there. Stop loss had gone away at that point, and for those of us who hadn't re-enlisted or extended yet, I think they were trying to kind of push us out and free up space for new guys to come in and go on that deployment. And I was undecided where I wanted to go, what I wanted to do. I think I was kind of ready for the next step. And special operations was definitely something that, was on my mind, especially after that deployment experience. But I also was just kind of wanted to get out. And, I had a little bit of a bad taste in my mouth after extended garrison life, right? I think that wasn't, at the time specifically, that wasn't really for me, right? And so they moved my ETS date to like 2011, and I was looking at getting out. And then I ended up talking to a buddy of mine about it, and he made a comment like, "Hey, man," he's like, "You've done one, you got to do at least two deployments, right?" And that may sound goofy, but it sounded good at the time. And they ended up sliding me into a senior medic spot in one of the other companies. And I ended up going on a second deployment with the 82nd. And on that deployment is kind of where I started my trip towards SOF.
What was that deployment like a little bit, if you want to speak on what you guys were doing in Kandahar and what was different about it versus the trip to Bala Murghab?
Yeah, so BMG was very like small unit tactics heavy, right? Like the Taliban would be able to amass guys like, squad, platoon size elements. There was times where we were up against Taliban elements that were, had as many people as we did. And so they would stay and fight it out. I mean, they were in BMG, there was times where like they were shooting at, cast platforms, doing gun runs on them. I think they ended up grounding an Apache at one point. They were absolutely willing to engage you with small arms fire, RPGs, things like that, and maneuver on each other and really just hammer it out. And which is like what I think a lot of us prefer, it's a little bit more exciting that way. But in Kandahar, it was very different. It was very much a lot of IEDs, especially dismounted IEDs. I think at that time, actually, it was the most IED place in the most mined place in the world. They were everywhere. If you couldn't walk down a path, take a road, whatever, really without worrying about that threat. And typically we didn't. We travel off a beaten path, literally quite often to kind of avoid that threat. So it's a very different environment, like tactically. And I think I enjoyed that deployment a lot, as from the senior medic standpoint. It was very satisfying having junior medics, being that company senior medic, and being able to have more of a hand in like the training and planning piece, but also have these like younger medics to like mentor. But overall, that deployment was very hard, I think, on a lot of us and our sister battalions. We lost a lot of guys in that trip. That IED threat was significant. And I think a lot of us went on patrols pretty much every day, wondering if that was going to be the day that we step on something.
Have you are you familiar with the book called The Hardest Place at all? It's by a journalist named Wesley Morgan. He did a bunch of trips to Afghanistan, embedding with Royal Marines, embedding with the Army up in Kunar and Kandahar and a few other places.
What's called the hardest place?
Yeah, the hardest place, the U.S. military drift in the Pech Valley, something along the lines of that.
I have not, man. I'm gonna have to check that out.
Yeah, so something
Yeah,
he
that sounds
mentions
awesome.
is, obviously you didn't go to the Pech, but what they saw was a lot of dudes would deploy somewhere like the Pech, in an environment that's, maybe doesn't have so many IDs, but is very kinetic as far as the small arms threat goes, like, getting into platoon size engagements with the Taliban, and then they rotate somewhere else, like, Zari, or, they go to Helmand where the environment is very much just, hey, static IEDs. If you get shot
Yeah,
at, you can't go into cover just because of the ID threat. And they'll find that a lot of
exactly.
guys ended up, missing the valley, and they tried their best to kind of get themselves back into positions where they deployed a Kunar, whether that was, going for, SFAS, or, going to the Ranger battalions where the tempo was a little bit more predictable as to where you were going. Did you kind of find that happen to you at all, where you were just trying to capture, what that first deployment was like over the course of your next couple ones? Always going back and comparing it and contrasting it.
Yeah, absolutely, man. In fact, that is incredibly relatable. I the Taliban obviously, and so it's funny that you mentioned Zari. It's kind of like we were in Zari and Maiwand as well. I think we did some stuff maybe in Panjwai, but
Out of
in that.
curiosity, at that point, had the Canadians left Panjwai and Kandahar? Were they still around?
So I don't remember seeing too many Canadians around. I so um, that trip was kind of unique in that for the most part it was just us, like the OP that we were on, which is a place called Gunigar, Cotton Gunigar, which is a unique little spot. It was like a hill, just very tall hill, maybe a very small mountain. I don't know. In the middle of this valley, and um, you know, we were kind of at the top of that, and so you're allegedly the spot was built by Alexander the Great. I don't know, but yeah, it was only us. As 82nd guys there for the most part. I don't remember seeing, we didn't really work with soft too much on that deployment. We didn't really, I knew they were on the other side of the river, that the Helmand River or Argonaut River. Um, but yeah, I didn't really, there's no real joint stuff going on or anything like that. Um, it's pretty much just us. So
So, unless there's something you want to mention about that deployment, closing it out, how soon do you get into the special operations combat medic course, and what's the process to actually getting a slot there and being able to go?
yeah, man. So I ended up getting a slot on that trip. Um, so I had to. I I remember having to like put my packet together while I was in country, which is, as you can imagine, not super easy. You gotta get like a physical, do all that stuff. But I I had leadership that I think kind of saw some potential in me and knew that I had mixed feelings about staying in or getting out. And what ended up happening was kind of they pulled some strings and got me into that course. And I think I was kind of handpicked maybe by some people over there to come out. I don't know exactly how that worked. Um, but I was basically told, hey man, like if we think you should go this route and um, if this is if you think you can do it, you know, you got a slot. And so we came back from that deployment late 2012. And then I'd say like summer of 2013, I was reporting to SOCM.
So backing up just for a second, how common
Mhm.
is that for conventional guys to get slots to a course like that? And just for the listeners that maybe aren't as familiar, do you want to kind of explain what the SOCM course entails?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say it's pretty uncommon, very uncommon for guys to end up getting that chance and going that route. There's kind of a theme throughout my career is that I ended up being very lucky in a lot of ways, having stuff just right place, right time. Some of the people I've worked with, some of the schools I've gotten to go to, things like that, experiences I've had, and this is really no different. That's I think quite rare that something like that happens because not only is your unit sending you, not only are you being sent to the school with a limited amount of slots that your conventional units don't get slots to. But the conventional side is now losing you, right? They're not sending you to SOCM and then getting you back. Like you go to SOCM and you are now in the special operations community in one capacity or another, right? So because they trained you, so they're going to and invested in you, they're going to use you. And so when I went to SOCM, it was 9 months long. Um, and the initial phase was um, EMT, and then you move into some more clinical medicine, anatomy type stuff. And then you had a couple trauma phases after that, and where you do a lot of casualty assessments under stress, and that's the portion I would say most people fail. And then you kind of learn to put that together in a teachable C type scenario, and then setting. And then at the end of the course, you do more um, like house model resuscitative. At least when I went through, you do more house model like resuscitative type stuff, um, and maybe sitting on that couch a little bit longer. It was to this day one of the best courses I've ever been to. SOCM produces the best medics on the planet. You have joint, there's international students there that'll come there and attend SOCM. Um, it is, it's a phenomenal course. And on the conventional side, AIT, Sustainment Whiskey AIT does a good job of producing medics, but that is a 2 month EMT course and then a 2 month, or at least when I went through, and then a 2 month combat medic course. Whereas SOCM is like 3 weeks maybe of EMT, getting you credentialed in that. And then the rest is all not just the how to be a medic and what to do, but the why, right? Which I think is really important. So it is a phenomenal course.
So how academically rigorous did you find SOCM, going into it?
Man, I had to learn. I kind of had to learn how to learn all over again. You had guys there who we had guys in the class who had college degrees. A lot of the 18 X-rays, especially. You had guys who there's even maybe one or two guys in our class who had like a master's, and it was still a pretty rigorous course academically. I would say of my class of about, man, I would say we had roughly 55 or 60 students in my class. We had probably about 40 when we started one of the phases of trauma 2, and maybe a little bit less than that. And then we lost exactly half the class to that phase of trauma 2, that portion of the course.
Dang.
So, yeah. So I think from my understanding, it has a roughly 33% first time um, pass rate, like all the way through without recycling. So it's a pretty intensive course.
That's just interesting to hear about because a lot of the times you'll hear about these soft courses or these soft selections, and the attrition rate will, almost exclusively come from the physical side of it. From whether it's obstacle course or guys getting med dropped or whatever the case may be. The reasons are always mostly on the physical side. So it's always interesting to hear about a soft course that's known for its attrition, but not so much on the physical side, but rather just pure academics and learning and actually doing the job in the course.
Yeah, they have a very high standard there as far as not just your ability to like pass those tests, but then your ability to put that into practice during your hands-on like assessments and your practical exams, right? There's a very detailed test there called the PIN test that a lot of people fail, struggle with. That's like in the anatomy portion, and um, basically you have to identify, a nerve or a muscle group and what its function is, or what nerve it's innervated by, or what it innervates, and yada yada yada. It's very detailed, and then organ function, and there's like so much going on that test. And I think that was like one of the academically like one of the monsters a lot of us were concerned about. And then got into the practical portion, and there's one there's one portion that's hands-on that you're being graded. You have an instructor sitting there watching you and grading you off a checklist for basically an hour and a half, I think it is, on like a few phases of care. And that I would say is probably like the single um, most failed point of the course. So it's pretty intense, but it's a phenomenal course.
What background did most of the instructors come from? Are they all typically that 18 Delta SF model, or did you see a bit of cross pollination in the communities they came from?
Yeah, you had a pretty good mix. There was guys who were a lot of 18 deltas, both still active duty and retired like contractors, right? You had guys who were from like the Navy and like Raider communities. You had I think maybe some Rangers in there. You had some civilians of various backgrounds. You had like, a there was a guy who was like a PA with a JSOC medical unit that was retired, who was like one of the instructors there. There was some phenomenal guys. And we had like, man, we had like one instructor. There's some wild instructors there. We had one guy who he was in 18 Delta, I believe, and had been in a helicopter crash in like Afghanistan. He, when the crash happened, I want to say he like broke his pelvis. He definitely had like most of his teeth knocked out. Um, Probably like a TBI. And, instead of really treating himself, he crawled around to his other guys and treated them, stabilized them until they all got evac'd out of there. And, then he ended up going to that instructor spot, going to school. And I think if I remember correctly, he ended up getting accepted to med school. So those are some of the types of instructors you had, just um, very impressive resumes, backgrounds, and solid dudes. And they just wanted to really like see you do well, see what kind of how you could perform, and make sure that you were, someone they wanted taking care of them or their guys, former teammates, whatever down the road, because there's solid chance that you could be. So.
So what happens after that for a conventional dude that's maybe not aligned to, the 18, the 18 Delta model like you mentioned, or maybe the Ranger 68 whiskey model? What does it look like for you as a conventional dude finishing SOCM? Where do you go after that?
So my understanding is that it kind of turns into a um, all the heads of the different tribes and stuff, right? End up getting together and basically um, doing like a draft, pretty much, for those of us who were unassigned, right? And so I didn't really know where I was going until pretty late, towards the end of the course. I think actually once I passed like trauma two, I kind of knew where. I didn't really figure out till then like where I was going to be headed. But yeah, I think they kind of do like fight it out basically for the guys they want the most. We had I've seen guys go to 160th. Obviously, guys went to the unit that I was in. I've seen people. I've heard of people getting asked to try out for JSOC slots. Um, some guys go CA, I believe. So it tends to be like a pretty good mix.
Fair enough, man. So what does it look like for you getting to your unit? And correct me if I'm wrong, but you were on a special operations resuscitation team. Is that what your role ended up being once you got to the unit?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So, I finished up SOCM. I went on rotations, did like our month-long rotation at the end of the course. Uh,
What was
and
that rotation like? Where'd you go? And for those, for the listeners that aren't really familiar, at the end of SOCM you have a do they call it like a clinical phase or like a rotation sort of phase where you go and essentially serve as a paramedic at an ER, riding in the back of ambulances. And oftentimes they'll set them up to be in major American cities where the chances of, seeing traumatic stuff like gunshot wounds are typically a little bit higher. Again, correct me if I'm wrong about any of that, but that's sort of my understanding of how that rotation works for you guys.
yeah, that's exactly right, man. So when I went through, there was like four sites that you could go to. There was um, two spots in Tampa, at hospitals out there, I believe, or at least in that area. There was one in Richmond, one site in Richmond, and there was one site in Flint, Michigan. And that was, I think, maybe the one that was more highly sought after. It was newer, and I think a lot of us have heard stuff about Flint and how it's kind of kinetic there on its own, right, at times. And so that's what I wanted. That's fortunately what I ended up getting was Flint.
Yeah,
And
that's where you get your CONUS CIB, eh?
yeah, yeah, exactly, yeah. So I mean. at the time, I don't think the other guys necessarily have that experience, but we got issued body armor there, and we wear that under like our SOCM shirts or whatever our uniform was for like the duty day, and then obviously not in the hospital, but on the street stuff. And so you were doing um, shifts in the hospital, and you would, if I remember correctly, you were doing like back to back shifts on both the SOC on the both the hospital and then the EMS side. So you would do like roughly, I want to say like 16 hours probably, and then um, week on, week off, you'd be like in the hospital, and the next week you go work. For us in Flint, we actually didn't work on ambulances. I believe they did at other sites. We actually worked with sheriff's deputies who were also paramedics. So they drove like Tahoes, and they would have like their medical gear and stuff in the back, and they'd go on medicine medical calls, but they would also, if necessary, go on just average, like those standard law enforcement calls.
Right.
And yeah, that was a incredible experience. I learned a lot working at that hospital there. The staff were fantastic. They were very much about making sure that you got legitimate hands-on experience and training. They were very welcoming to us. Nurses, the physicians, everybody, it was excellent, and that was a really good experience. And I think that's actually, obviously you're going through SOCM and it's difficult, right? And like soft medics are, you know, pretty high, have a pretty high standard. But I think going on those rotations, not only does it gain you experience, but also builds that confidence in your own abilities, because you're in these fairly high level, conversations about, resuscitating a patient or the right, treatment approach, or you're doing those actual hands-on things and you realize like, man, like I can fucking do this and I can hang. And so that was a great experience. They are, I actually, I enjoyed working there so much, both in the hospital and on the, paramedic slash street side of the house. I actually tried to like extend and stay. It didn't happen, but that was a fantastic experience. And I'm glad, it sounds like they've opened up more sites now. I'm really glad those guys still get to do that.
I got you. So, going back to being on the sorts, the special operations resuscitation teams, what does the makeup of them kind of look like? What's their mission set? I know a lot of our listeners, they might be familiar with, maybe the JSOC side of it, the Joint Medical Augmentation Unit, but the sort specifically is not really something
Yeah,
that, there's a lot of information out there about. So, can you just kind of speak to that a little bit?
absolutely. So when when I was there, the SORT teams comprised of, you had a physician who was typically either ER or family practice, but could be something like maybe internal med. So a specialty that's relatively like well-rounded, right? And is going to deal with stuff you'll see day to day, but also resuscitatively. Um, you had an ER or critical care nurse, and then you had a platoon sergeant, or sorry, a team sergeant who was a SOCM. And then you had um, a senior SOCM who was typically like an E6 or E5, and then a junior SOCM who was like an E4 or E5 typically. You would also have what was commonly called while I was there the ancillary personnel, which would be like a lab tech. You had a lab tech, you had an X-ray tech, and there was a couple patient admin guys running around. And then we also had, believe it or not, a dental cell, but they didn't really deploy that I know of, at least not while I was there. Um, but everybody kind of cross-trained, and you would have a guy who was like, I had one dude, phenomenal guy who was like an X-ray tech, but he was also a teachable C instructor. You know what I mean? So very competent on that aspect, even like in an austere environment. And kind of the philosophy of a SOAR team was you had a team that you could attach to like a special forces like AOB or a ODA itself, SEAL team, whatever, right? And you basically have almost like a traveling ER team with you. Now, that's like a heavy, what we call like a heavy concept. And frequently, you didn't actually have like those ancillary personnel deploying occasionally, but not often. Frequently, it was like doc, nurse, and the SOCMs who would go out. And then also, you could, depending on the team need, you could split that, right? So you could maybe for like one mission, you're doing just the SOCM and that nurse together attaching to that ODA, or just the SOCMs, or just doc, nurse, SOCM, right? So it was a pretty like plug and play at the time concept, and there was a lot of working with the teams to figure out like what was best for them for that mission set, and what was kind of dictated by, you know, the mission. Uh, um, but essentially, your role, no matter whether it's like a light concept, like a light role, or like a heavier team that you're attaching to that ODA or whatever, you are doing what's called damage control or resuscitation. So your role is to, it's basically like an ER team you would see in the States. You know, you got that casualty comes in and you are, you know, plugging those holes, getting blood on board, getting air moving in and out of the holes that should, and, you know, fixing any holes that shouldn't be moving out of, and getting them stabilized and getting them either holding them or getting them to surgery. And how that's valuable to like an ODA is you have guys who, you have medics that you can attach to those assault elements now who, you know, your 18 deltas can push the fight, push that partner force. Even if you take casualties, that flow doesn't really stop, right? So those SOCMs can take over those casualties. They can evac with them if needed, and that ODA doesn't lose its organic medics. You could potentially set up like a house model, you know, shack or a basin, whatever, somewhere, and have a little bit heavier model, taking casualties as, you know, we had guys that we'll talk about on later deployments, I'm sure. There's times where we get 5, 10, 15 casualties at a time, and that's a lot for a team with 1 delta or
Right.
2 deltas, you know? So you not only are lightening that team's load medically, but you're also increasing the survivability of anybody who gets hurt.
So now that you're in a unit that's aligned under the special operations side of the world, what are your deployments starting to look like? Where are you guys going? Who are you supporting on those deployments? And really, what are you guys doing as an asset, as a medical asset in that kind of zone?
Yeah, so I had kind of a unique experience in that I had 3 deployments over there, and they were 3 completely different types of mission sets or, you know, employments for me or for us. So my first trip in special operations was to Africa, and I was working with, you had a couple ODAs, a few ODAs in a few different countries there, and I worked with all those teams. Typically, they would either be a light, a medic, or one team lost both their medics to other, like one guy had like a potential illness. He had to be evac'd out. The other one had to come home for some family stuff. So I would be basically that, I'd come into that role, fill that role with those guys left, or plus up those teams that were short of a medic. And so I would go out in the jungle with the guys. I would go do training with the partner force. There's times where I was flying to go pick some partner force guys up who were sick or injured out in the middle of nowhere in the jungle. So it's a pretty cool experience. Obviously, it was awesome working with the teams and getting a feel for that and learning how to integrate with them, but also such a different and unique mission set.
Yeah, expanding on that a little bit. So on the last episode, we had on Derek, who was a Marine Raider, and he did a very kinetic deployment in 2019 to Afghanistan, where they were hitting targets for the JSOC task force at the time. That's who they were under.
Mhm.
And the next deployment after, he ends up going to Senegal, and he talks a
Awesome.
bit about how they were working out of a team house versus like a fob or airfield on the previous deployment, and
Hmm.
how the situation was a lot different than you would see in Iraq or Afghanistan. Did you kind of see that too? Was a lot of people aren't aware of the level of involvement the United States has in Africa and specifically
Yeah.
what they're doing. So if you want to talk about that a little bit and how it compared and contrasted to your deployments to say a more mature theater like Afghanistan.
Hmm. Yeah. So Africa was so where we were at, there was still, like small FOBs, or they call them FOSSs, forward outstations. But the environment was a lot different, right, than like Afghanistan, which is where my previous rotations had been to. So you could go shopping in the local bazaar for groceries, right? You could be you could hang out with like the partner force and be it was more like relaxed environment. We had Wi-Fi, which is nice, you know what I mean, compared to Afghanistan, like getting able to talk to people back home. I noticed that SOF likes to deploy with Wi-Fi, which is pretty cool. So I think we all like that. But nah, it was a phenomenal experience doing something so different and being able to like run around the jungle. I don't know, like we would do training on like one of the airfields, and you'd hear like, "Oh, hey man, like we have to be careful. There's like a leopard that patrols around here."
Oh man.
uh, so it's just very different. And we were. I think the mission itself was kind of unique in who our role there, which was, of course, to try to negate the influence of the LRA and to um, both kind of protect the locals in that region. We would bring them, do partner force patrols, things like that, train those guys up, but also to interdict those LRA operations. So it was a good trip.
That's awesome, man. And speaking a little bit more about Africa, you mentioned on your previous deployment that you guys were generally always co-located with the Blackhawks, like the dust off elements. And I can
Hmm.
imagine even in BMG, you guys weren't that far away from medical support. How did that kind of look like for you guys in Africa? Not to get too much into specifics, but what did the medical infrastructure look like? I can't imagine you guys were within the golden hour of treatment out there.
Yeah, man. Very, very different. Very different. Obviously, Africa is a massive continent. I don't think most people realize how large it is. But I mean, some of those evac times you were looking at. Afghanistan, you could get a casualty off your hands and pass along to a medevac flight in 15 minutes, sometimes less. Definitely, I would say it was probably pretty rare typically that if you were like a medic at that point of injury, that you were holding on to a guy for an hour or more, right? I would say that's pretty rare. But um, man, in Africa, you would have a guy who would get injured and then come to you. He wouldn't get to you until a few hours later, or you wouldn't be able to go get him until a few hours later. And then maybe you're sitting on him for another 8 hours, 10, 12 hours. Um, and, that whole chain of like moving through the phases of care could take, you know, 12 hours, 18 hours a day. So, we had an example that was we had some guys who, partner force guys who got ambushed during a patrol, shot up, and one of them was developing what's called compartment syndrome. So, a couple of our medics flew out and picked them up in the helicopter and then brought him and another guy to us. And we start treating them, resuscitating them, and we take a closer look kind of at this guy, specifically his legs, and we realize that having gotten shot, he was developing something called compartment syndrome. And so he didn't arrive to us till about 8 hours, I would say, post initial injury. Depending on who you ask, you have in the situation, you have roughly like 4 to 6 hours with, like, for example, a tourniquet on or something of that nature, where you're risking like losing that limb, right? And in this case, it's a similar kind of mechanism. Basically, you have so much pressure build up in those tissue compartments in that limb that you can have, that blood flow gets cut off, that tissue can start to die, right? So, and we knew that, like, hey, we're going to have this guy for a while. He's not going to get evac'd out of here anytime soon. And so we ended up doing what's called a fasciotomy on him, where we opened up his leg and cut open those tissue compartments basically and relieved that pressure, and we're able to save his leg, which was fucking awesome, but that's the kind of stuff that you're dealing with in a place like Africa, and kind of moving away from that traditional GWOT model, where you now have, I think this is some of the forces probably running into as a whole, where we're realizing you have to have the capability of doing that prolonged care, and some of the procedures that come with that, some of the in-depth treatments, maybe some of that almost like nursing type care that comes with that, to ensure those optimal outcomes for those casualties. So
Yeah, man. I mean, it's going to be interesting to see as the army and the military transitions to more of that large scale combat operations fight. How if the golden hour is still a concept that's still viable. I can struggle to think about even the situation in Ukraine right now. Can't imagine that those guys always have access to Casevac, Medevac, whatever the case might be. So yeah, cool that you're able to speak on that a little bit. So getting back from that deployment, how did you kind of compare your experiences, doing combat medicine on the conventional side versus now in SOF that you actually have, a SOF deployment under your belt? How were you able to kind of relate those two experiences, and how are they different from each other?
so I realized that I think a big factor there was, again, to like what we were just kind of talking about, how there's a likelihood now that I'm in SOF that I'm going to be in places where I don't have the luxury of handing those casualties off quickly. And so I do need to get better at that prolonged field care, maybe even like ventilator management, some more in-depth stuff, right? So that deployment was a great learning experience. but also kind of a wake up call in terms of like, hey, like you're not going to these very well established, highly built up theaters anymore. You have to be on it as far as these other phases of care. And I I felt like my medicine was good, but I realized it needed to get better, and that um, let's say that I am somewhere where it is a I'm trying to remember the terms that we use for this. But basically, let's say that I am somewhere that's not okay, like somewhere that's not a defined theater of combat operations, right? Like let's say I'm somewhere where we're doing like more of a low vis mission. I might have to sit on a guy in a hotel room somewhere or a safe house for who knows how long. I think what they say is like as a SOCM, you're expected to be able to sit on for a casualty for up to like 72 hours. That's very, I think, realistic with some of these non OIF, OEF theaters, right, in operations. So that for me was like, all right, I need to be better. And I think really the force as a whole has been seeing that since really that same time frame, like mid, probably about 2015 or so. There's been a lot of say, hey, like the golden hour is what we've planned on, but we need to, what do we do when we can't rely on that? How are we going to train and equip guys to be prepared for that, to increase those casualty survivability rates? You look at like Ukraine, that's an awesome example. You mentioned that. What do I do if I'm working in an area where I take a casualty and we don't have air superiority, right? Those, whatever force that we're fighting, that we're engaged with, they have, anti-aircraft capabilities. They have fixed wing aircraft that are able to threaten our, medevac platforms, things of that nature. So the force as a whole is really looking at that right now, I think.
So getting home from that, I know the unit that you were with sort of transitioned into that anti-ISIS fight over in Iraq and Syria. So, in between, do you go to any schools once you're back home? Is there a training cycle that gets you prepped for the next deployment, which was to the Middle East, if I'm correct?
Yeah, so this was my first full PMT cycle with one of those teams. So my deployment to Africa, I was kind of thrown in on a team that's gone out the door last minute, which is good. I wanted to go, but I didn't really get that full like pre-mission training that they had been able to do. So the Syria rotation was my first opportunity to do that, and that included quite a bit of training. There was a lot more in-depth shooting going on. You were training with ODAs. At Bragg, for example, on using some of the heavier weapon systems, as well as, doing ranges, static and more dynamic ranges. You were doing driver's courses, learning various driving techniques. We did more prolonged casualty care training courses, some low vis stuff. Let's see. We did. I went on a MPT rotation to San Antonio, and I got to work there with some of the more complex patients in like the ICU and stuff there. I think that helped prepare me quite a bit. We were doing ultrasound training. I mean, a lot. It was a phenomenal PMT. I got to do Jade Helm with a CRIF, supporting them as a medic, kind of seeing that piece as well. So it really rounds you out, not just your medical skills, but also your soldier skills. You're kind of honing and building those. So you can bring the most to that deployment.
So I do know that you attended the military free fall course out at Yuma. Was that during this time period, or did that kind of happen a little bit later?
Yeah, that actually ended up happening a couple years later. That happened actually after I left that unit. It was a kind of a requirement for the next role that I took on, and that itself was also a incredible course. I mean, listen, man. I think if you ask the average dude in the army, top three schools, top five schools he wants to go to, that's probably going to be in there, right? And that was a incredible course. I'm very glad I got that opportunity for sure.
That's awesome, man. So yeah, going to the next deployment to Syria, what did that look like for you guys? Again, where were you? Who were you supporting? What was the mission set sort of like for the sort there versus Africa?
Yeah, so we worked with Fifth Group, obviously, primarily in Syria, and we were out. I was in the eastern part of the country, excuse me, and I happened to be lucky enough to be there again, lucky when a pretty major operation kicked off. So we got to a relatively smaller outpost. I think we were there for probably about 2 months, waiting for operations in another part of the country to wrap up. And then once that did, we kind of got the green light, and then it became basically a clearing operation down with the partner force led, obviously, as Syria very much was, but a clearing operation down through that Euphrates River Valley. And all that land that ISIS had held, taking that back. And you had Syria was interesting because you had so many participants there, right? You had obviously the regime and the Russians. You had Iran was there. You have multiple different non-government entities there, and all working with sometimes overlapping or complementary interests and goals, and sometimes competing goals. And it was a pretty unique mission set, I think, because of that. But our role essentially as a SORT team was to enable those ODAs to push far forward along with the partner force, and kind of push deep into what was ISIS territory, take that, right? Obviously, again, this was very partner force led, so there was standoff. Us and the ODA had standoff from that partner force, but they would take ground, and the whole way we're like leapfrogging compound to compound. We're like bouncing through that valley, taking casualties the whole time, essentially, right? Like, so that was our role, was to set up in a usually formerly ISIS owned building, probably, and build basically like we could roll out almost like a resuscitation model in, man, like an hour or two,
Right.
probably significantly less actually, and just pop that up and be ready to go, and those casualties would come in. We'd resuscitate them, save them, do whatever, and then push them typically back to that partner force healthcare system, and then continue to go. And I think we probably hit, I would say, off the top of my head, 6 or 7 different sites.
Right.
And yeah, it was a great experience.
How did you guys integrate with the ODAs on that deployment? I know a lot of SOF units will be a little averse to having, support elements come in, even if they are
Yeah.
soft. How did you guys kind of integrate with them? Did you have any issues, or was it kind of plug and play?
Man, so each team personality is different, right? There's some teams, that were very welcoming. There's others who may be a little bit standoffish, and others maybe a little bit more so. And that's fine. You have to, I think, show that you have to earn their trust, show that you belong there, right? And once you do that, there's no problems. It's all, they are happy to have you there. I know that there was one, so on the FOB in Syria that we were on, there was like a row of houses, right? There's like a street, and there's houses on each side of the street. And each team had their own house, basically, which was awesome. But you had a couple ODAs on one side of the street, and the one across the street from our house, man, these guys, every team, they have multiple gun trucks, right? And we were no different. We had standard and non-standard platforms. I think we had probably 4 or 5 vehicles for our team alone, right? And so parking space is pretty limited. And these fucking guys for this other team kept parking their trucks in front of our house. And so there was like a little bit of friction there, right? Initially. But man, the first time that we had a mass casualty incident, um, probably like a month or two later, was with that team. And they got to see us work. They got to see us take these casualties, guys had been blown up. In that instance, it had been multiple vehicle-borne IEDs, multiple car bombs that had hit partner force checkpoints. And so we had like kind of a flood of these pretty seriously injured casualties all at once. And so they saw us go to work, and we were integrating them. We had them. I mean, the Deltas were helping us out. We had guys on the team were helping us as translators. Other guys were working, just doing the more simple stuff like throwing tourniquets, etc. And seeing that, I think, kind of flipped the switch of like, hey, we're glad these guys are here, And from that point on, it was smooth sailing, and that was pretty much the experience we had with every team.
That's cool, man. Really cool that you guys were able to show that you are a viable asset. And I can imagine that they appreciated having you guys around. So I do know
Yeah,
that you guys, I've seen you talk about it offline, is that you guys cleared out what eventually became to be Green Village, which was one of the major sort of outpost fobs in Syria. Do you want to talk about that at all?
yeah, of course. So we came into Green Village. Uh, that was, I think, one of the last sites that I was at and my team was at. And so we came to Green Village, we convoyed in at nighttime. And obviously that was very kind of eerie, very unusual because, for those of people who don't know, where we're at in Syria was largely like open desert. And then, you'd have patches of like small towns. They were kind of similar to what you would see in Afghanistan, in that like they would be, those like more primitive or whatever you want to describe them as, like, you know, huts and compounds, and very much like, yeah, we're in Syria, right? Looking at these. But then Green Village was very, I mean, they were like, you had like hard structures that were like, it would almost be out of like a Western city. There was, a small little shopping area there. They had a school. They had a clinic. They had like apartment buildings or condos. It was all like very modern looking. And I think it had only been, I mean, if it was 10 years old, I'd probably be surprised by that. It was pretty new looking. Obviously, then ISIS swept through there, and it was just a mess. But yeah, so we rolled in. It was nighttime, and I remember you had our EOD guys or Navy EOD guys who were sweeping some of these buildings for IED threats, right? And so they went in there. I volunteered to go with them in case something happened. You had pretty complex IED threats in country at the time. Their TTPs were pretty advanced, and we had lost some EOD guys in country. So we were very aware of that. So I volunteered to go with them, and we cleared out what was a school that we ended up staying in for a little bit. And that went on for, I don't know, an hour or two. And we start going back to the row of trucks where the other guys are at. And I hear somebody's yelling, don't get in the trucks, don't get in the trucks. But I hear, get in the trucks. And that turned out to, obviously I learned very quickly that was not the right answer. They started yelling at me. We all, me and the EOD guys moved back and kind of got with these dudes, and we were huddled under basically like a parking structure, like a pavilion type thing almost. But what was going on was there was a fixed wing aircraft that had done a show of force over our convoy there, and it was not American.
Right.
And I'm not really going to speculate too hard as to who it was, but there's only a couple people in country at the time with that capability.
Right.
Yeah, so that was pretty nerve-wracking, right? Because now obviously you're like, man, if he circles back and hits these trucks, or decides to strike us, we're toast, And allegedly, they ended up scrambling some F-22s and getting them on station, and were able to provide overhead cover for us and chase that bird off. I know that pretty much the rest of our time there, we had those birds on station kind of having our back. So
yeah, which
Green Village is wild, man.
Definitely crazy to think about, because only a few months, I believe, after you guys sort of set up Green Village under that whole AOB East site is when they had the Battle of Kasham, where the mercenaries and the Syrians made a run at that outpost. So yeah, definitely very interesting to hear about that element. Up until that point, you'd been deploying to you'd been deploying to Afghanistan, Africa, where you had, you were dealing with the non-state actors. You had the Taliban, the LRA, and now you're dealing with, an adversary of the United States. So
Yeah.
very, very interesting to hear about it.
I'll be honest, man. That deployment was awesome. Both came to work with the teams that we did. I cannot speak highly enough about the teams that we worked with. Those guys were incredible, and I learned a lot working with them. I also really enjoyed the getting to do that, medic specific piece. I got to do a lot as far as, and all of our people did, as far as treating casualties with complex wound sets, injuries, and, resuscitating these guys and doing stuff that really you've always kind of wanted and hoped to do as a medic, to get to employ those skills, right? But man, I will always regret missing out on the Battle of Kasham, because I've heard some things, and that was
Yeah, no, I can only imagine.
That's surreal.
I can only imagine. So before we kind of close up that deployment, if you want to talk a bit about just the partner force that you guys were working with, how'd you find them versus, Africa, Afghanistan? And I understand that those guys were the ones that you were treating, that they were the ones that were taking the brunt of the casualties. At this point, a lot of people might not be familiar with the OIR piece of it. They might be familiar with OIF, but at this point, the Iraqis, the Kurds, the Syrians had really sort of taken the mantle of the conflict, and you had American forces that were doing the advise, assist, and accompany mission, kind of behind the flot, still getting into kinetic engagements, but their job at that point was to support the SDF and their tactical movement. So what was it like working with them?
Man, I've had positive experiences with. I've worked with, I don't know, I would say roughly five different partner forces. Those guys were the best. Um, Both, I would say probably tactically, but also, besides maybe some of the partnered special operations units I worked with, but also just their willingness to be there and their devotion to the mission was next level, right? And they were, man, those guys, they were very good to us. And I mean, once we started taking taking their casualties in and treating those guys, um, they were bringing us what little they would share what little food they had, with us, because obviously we're all kind of living a little rough. Um, and just really it was very shoulder to shoulder stuff. They I remember a partner force general kind of coming to us and telling us essentially hey, my guys my guys are able to, push harder and fight harder and longer because they know that if they get hurt, that they will live because they've seen what you've done with, our people who have been hurt, right? And it makes them braver and it makes them stronger. And that was awesome, man. I mean, that's probably one of the coolest things that you can hear as a medic or anything, you know what I mean, is to know that you are enabling that partner force and instilling that confidence in them. And man, I'm very grateful that I got to work with them. Um, they're incredible.
Yeah, that's awesome, man. And part of the reasons of why we ask questions like that is that we feel when you hear in the greater conversation around the GWOT, you don't hear that much about the partner forces. Whether that's because certain elements are incompetent or whatever the case might be, I think it's definitely important to
Mhm.
push those stories out as well. That the fight went a lot deeper than just the coalition side of it. There was people in the partner forces that were dying for their country every day. So really cool that you're able to talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it was very different than Afghanistan, for example, in that uh, a lot of the stuff that we did in Afghanistan was partnered, um, but a lot of the stuff that we did in Syria was not only partnered, but very partner force led. And I think that was hard at times for some of us, especially those of us who did have previous deployment experience, to kind of, I don't want to say take a back seat necessarily, but not be directly shoulder to shoulder with them in every aspect of the fight. But to see how effective they were and go forth and get those results with the training that we gave them, and to see how successful they were, but also how grateful they were, it was incredibly rewarding. And um, yeah, man, I really just can't say enough about how awesome that partner force was.
So closing that
So,
out, what happens when you get back? What does the process look like as far as you deploying next, which was Afghanistan?
yeah, yeah. So um, I came back uh, late 2017, and I didn't know kind of what the next step was going to be for me. I was looking at a couple different options, maybe assessing for another unit, um, maybe just PCSing to a different SOF unit. I wasn't really too sure And then I'd been back for a few months, probably about 6 months or so, and one of our other teams kind of got a heads up, like, hey, there's a request for forces for Afghanistan, and we didn't really know a whole lot. I was on that team at the time, um, and it was only supposed to be it was only like a 3-month trip, and I, the attitude at the time was like, well, it's probably not going to happen, so we're not super worried about it, but we're going to train like it's going to happen. They had actually, I think they were already into their PMT anyway, their pre-mission training anyway, which is why they got picked to go. Whereas I was kind of more in a mentorship role with my previous team, who had a lot of people had rotated out or left, either gone to different teams, PCS, whatever. So I stayed, and I was kind of asked to help train some of those more junior guys that had arrived to that team and pass along some experience and TTPs and things like that, which is awesome. I was more than happy to do that. And I was in the hall one day and I bumped into the other team, and I said, jokingly, kind of like, hey, you guys need another medic? And they're like, you trying to go? And I was like, man, I'd love to, right? And I didn't really think anything about that. And I don't think it was necessarily, I mean, maybe they took it a little bit to heart. It wasn't a serious possibility in my mind or theirs that any of us would go. But I ended up going to a mountain medicine course. Week or two after that, I was out there for a little bit, and got a call from our first sergeant, and it was basically like, hey man, did you mean what you said? Would you be willing to go? And I was like, yeah, absolutely. And
Yeah, how many
a couple
seconds did
weeks
it take
later,
you to make that decision on the phone?
very, very quick, very quick. Yeah. I mean, I wanted to go. To be honest, I wanted to go back to Afghanistan. Um, that was almost a decade after my first trip there. I wanted to work with Seventh Group. Was there at the time. I wanted to work with them. I had some friends that were over there in that group. And I didn't know if they were in country at the time, but it sounded like a good opportunity. To be honest, I was getting a little bit antsy being back in garrison, and I wanted to get another trip in. So, probably 2 weeks after that phone call, I was headed down to Florida, and then I was out the door and on my way to Afghanistan.
So I know at this point the dynamics in Afghanistan had changed quite a bit since your last trip. At this point, I know most of the conventional forces were on the big fobs doing the whole, advising mission with the NA. And it was the ODAs, under the Special Operation Task Force that were actually going out every day and, hitting most of the targets. So, what was your experience there working with the ODAs?
So that was a super cool deployment because I got to work with multiple different teams, and it was typically whoever had the most kinetic mission lined up at the time, or whoever needed to go on like a raid, and like for a specific, if they had like maybe a specific HVT in mind or something of that nature, and they were going to be outside that like golden hour, really, right? So basically, the way they had it set up was that task force decided to take us as SOCMs, and occasionally the doc and nurse, and attach us to those teams. And man, like that whole trip was just like, you go meet a team, you would train up with them for a couple days in advance, be a part of the planning process and that conversation. And then you would go on this mission with them. Typically, it was like halves, like helicopter raids, but there was a couple like ground, like assault convoys and stuff like that in there. Um, and finish that mission up, have maybe like a day of refit, and then you'd be on to the next team and their mission. And that went on for like 3 months. And that was a great experience. Getting to do that more. Again, we all like that kinetic piece, I think, right? So getting to do that, but also work with some of the teams I got to work with over there. I mean, I'm sure, obviously, Andy. I got to work with his team,
Right.
uh, and in fact, I probably worked with his team the most over there. Um, and that was a great experience. And I did a couple raids with them, um, and that guy's a stud, man. So. Perfect.
Cool, man. So we're recording again, so we can start going whenever you're ready.
Yeah, yep.
Yeah, so just more about that deployment. I can only imagine that Afghanistan would have changed quite a bit, the AO and dynamic wise, and when you last deployed there, and was it, 2011?
Yeah, it was like 2012, I think was my last trip there prior to this. So, you know, and some of the areas I was in, man, it was like we passed through some places like out near Herat, for example, that I had been at, again, like almost a decade before. So that was very surreal seeing how much certain things had changed, how much other things hadn't, you know. I was very disappointed to see that there wasn't a green bean around anymore. That was a bummer. But yeah, man. So we would, go on these missions and really just bounce around the country. I did. I want to say it was the Tangi Valley. It's a Baki Barak. Went to like Helmand and Sangin. So I think we did like Uruzgan and Nangarhar as well.
Mm-hmm.
So really got to go all over the country, and I had been some of those places before. I had actually never been. I'd never gotten to do Helmand itself. So that was exciting. You know what I mean? To see, because you're running up against all different kinds of cells, their TTPs, things like that, and the different teams that I'm working with had different styles. Um, Man, I think the first raid that I went on with Andy's team, I mean, we spent uh, first, like, I remember getting off the bird and, we did our little, like, crescent, take a knee, face out, security, right? And as we are taking that pause and they're getting ready to push out, um, the Taliban already had guys moving in on us. And you just hear like the birds, open up overhead, like their guns kind of roar to life, right? You had, I think, an AC-130 opening them up. And then, that kicks off and then we immediately just start pushing and, doing this. Um, clearing this village, these different compounds, and then kind of mowing at a specific spot and spending most of that next day in contact with the Taliban. And I specifically remember hearing that they had said that we didn't let them sleep during the night, so they weren't going to let us sleep during the day. And
Mm.
I mean, we obviously didn't go on that mission with plans of sleeping much anyway, but they did not. So it was that was a really great experience. I think there's actually footage of that kicking around of that day from some of the guys who were there. And I got to work, you know, closely with Andy on that, which is a very valuable learning experience for me.
Right.
Um, yeah.
Definitely, man. Rest in peace. I definitely, I think I've seen that footage. It's definitely floating out on the internet somewhere. So, yeah, safe to say you made your mark on the internet a little bit.
Yeah, I think, obviously I had, you know how it goes, man. Like on those trips, a lot of guys are growing their beards out, their facial hair out, and
Hmm.
um, I think in one of the comments on that video, somebody said that I had a really good beard, so
There
I
you
can
go.
die happy now. That's a great compliment, So whoever said that, appreciate it, man.
So, out of all the districts that you worked in, what did you find to be the most kinetic place on that deployment? What was the most kinetic mission? If you just want to take us through that in detail.
Yeah, so I think all of them ended up, to be honest, they were all pretty kinetic. The one that actually wasn't, surprisingly, until kind of the end was um, the Tangi Valley. And so, like, we had infilled, there was like a downward slope to the valley, and then we'd infilled on like the mountain, like the peaks at the top of that. And um, walked in, kind of sprinted in really, and like started hitting these compounds. And we ended up taking some pucks, you know, person under control or put under control, basically taking them for a bit with a partner force. Um, some guys we thought were potentially Taliban or, we knew were Taliban. But we didn't really get engaged on that much. And then, the next night we're exfilling. And, um, we go to another set of peaks and we end up getting there probably like an hour or so before the birds come in. And I don't know how much you know about this valley, but that's right near where I believe it's Extortion 17
Hmm.
was shot down. So that was kind of at the back of my mind, right? Was like, that threat, the likelihood of infilling on a helicopter like platform and potentially getting shot out of the sky. So that to me was like really the most dangerous like enemy TTP that we could run into. And yeah, they didn't really engage us when we were set up in a compound during that day, even though obviously we wanted them to come out. But so um the next night when we left, I remember sitting next to one of the guys from the team, who I think he's out now. Um, but he was the Charlie on that team. And we're sitting there and we were like pretty sure that we might be seeing like lights on a neighboring peak. And but it was hard to tell, and obviously we've been without sleep for a while, and they weren't, it was pretty subtle, like little flashes here and there. But there was, I think that kind of keyed me in a little bit to keep an eye out over there. And so the birds come in, they ended up doing like pinnacle landings. So they just kind of put the back down, then we run on and we take off. And I remember I'm one of the last dudes on the bird. I'm on the one ramp and sorry, I'm next one side of the next to the ramp. Andy's on the other side, and then I think there was a couple more birds with other chalks that had taken off, and and I didn't see it, um, but apparently there was a couple. There was like a PKM that opened up allegedly, and maybe a RPG or two that got shot at us um, as we were leaving, and so I suspect that the Taliban's plan was again to kind of wait, lull us in, think that they weren't going to act, and then when we pulled out, try to shoot us out of the sky. So uh, I heard stuff from the guys and the other birds saying that they had been shot at, and yeah, so that's a pretty narrow miss, you know.
Oh yeah,
But
especially when you mention, like you said, the history of that particular region with Extortion 17 going down in the Tangi Valley as well. That's damn
yeah,
fucking
yeah,
insane.
absolutely. Yeah, it was pretty surreal. Other than that, man, we went to Helmand. Everybody's obviously heard, I think, quite a bit about Helmand and Sangin, like what that area is like.
Hmm.
And if you look at casualty rates from the coalition, where their folks at in Afghanistan, it's like primarily there's a spread of like, there's Kandahar province and then some of the stuff out in like Kunar and like, Paktika or Paktia, right? But there's like a focus in BMG, and then the most casualties by far were in Helmand, right? And so that one we convoyed in uh, with a partner force, and I would say pretty much immediately after. So we had like a couple objectives that we were going to hit at different villages, and that first, I mean, as soon as I don't know if it was Sangin proper, but as soon as we got in that area, we started getting lit up. And they were using mortars, they were using RPGs, PKMs, I mean, you name it.
At this point, was there
And
still a bit of coalition presence in Sangin, or was it pretty much just, hey, like this is Taliban fucking central?
yeah, it was like ANA and Taliban and us, man, So yeah, I don't think that there are as many um I mean, you had the again, like you said earlier, you had like the bigger fobs and stuff down there, but not like it was 5 or 10 years earlier by any means. Those smaller outposts had all pretty much collapsed in, and you had, a handful of bigger fobs, and then you had like BAF and CAF, obviously, but those smaller sites that like really like, that like more thorough presence just wasn't there anymore. So I think it was almost entirely, if those small stations were entirely partner force at that time, I believe.
So yeah, again, before we start, closing up that deployment, I know that you guys encountered the ISIS K threat, um, which
Mhm.
was somewhat new at that point. Obviously, you had the ISIS contingent that was in Iraq and Syria, but this was a much different, more like localized flavor of ISIS K.
Yeah.
How was it fighting them? I know their stronghold was mainly around that Nangarhar area. How was that?
Yeah. So um, I felt like, I think we, again, like you said, I think we primarily ran into them out, in the eastern part of the country. And I guess maybe from my point of view, like the way you really knew was, I mean, you like had some idea like with the mission plan and everything like that, but the real confirmation was like, um, kind of maybe some of their TTPs, but also like, after you clear them out and then find their, compound or their cache or whatever, and you start finding like, oh, this is a Taliban flag or this is an ISIS flag, what have you. But um, I think I think mostly it was. I think maybe the Taliban were more experienced, really. And so you could maybe tell a little bit that way. Um, but that's, I mean, that's hard to differentiate, especially in the moment, you know.
Right.
Um, uh, ICE is like a disease, man, you know. So I'm happy to stamp those dudes out wherever. And um, you know, I know there's a lot of uh, I think there's a lot of, you know, not just that sentiment among us, but you would see the Taliban, and there's be times where you'd hear like a gunfight, and it's like, oh, it's the Taliban and ISIS fighting it out, you know. So um, I I will say that I hope um, they do not continue to build a foothold there. I really haven't looked too much into it. I haven't really kept up maybe with Afghanistan stuff lately as much as I should have, or really since we pulled out. But you know, I would hope that the Taliban presence there, or sorry, that the ISIS presence there does not continue to grow. So
Yeah, I mean, it's gonna be interesting seeing how that situation develops. I mean, you obviously know this, but the Taliban absolutely fucking hates ISIS.
yeah,
So I can't imagine they're too keen on having those guys around in in their
yeah,
business. But yeah, like you said, man, that entire situation was just really interesting to see unfold. Personally, I mean, do you have any thoughts on just the way it was handled? How the United States left that country and sort of the process that HKIA and stuff, how that whole recovery went.
yeah. Man, that was like hard to watch. I think mostly, I mean, that was hard to watch, I think, for everybody, just because whether you feel that was inevitable or not, um, you know, obviously it wasn't optimal, right? Like even with us pulling out, like we knew that we were pulling out, but I think we hoped that um, the we didn't. I don't think we hoped it would go the way. Obviously, we didn't hope the way it would go that way, and I don't think a lot of us expected it to. Frankly, maybe some guys did, but you know, we were hoping we wanted the ANA to be successful. You know, I think a lot of us had invested a lot of time, you know, blood, sweat, and tears in uh, you know, that country, and so you want to see it succeed. You want to see the partner force that you work with succeed. You know, I spent, you know, about 2 years of my life there. Um, so you want them to do well. And so that was hard to watch, but I think it was very hard to watch for me because especially like the HKIA stuff, because I, again, I wanted to be there, you know?
Hmm.
And especially when you had that mass casualty incident as a medic, it was like, fuck, man, like I know if I could be there. And from what I've heard, I think that the guys who were there, like the medics, everybody who was on scene, did a phenomenal job. I know some guys who were over there during all that in different roles.
Right.
Um, but you know, I, I will, I didn't really have a say, but I will always probably regret like not having been able to help out at least with that. And um, it was hard for me too because I had an interpreter for my first deployment that I was still in touch with, who was in country, and so like while all of that was happening, he was reaching out to me and some other guys about trying to get him out of there, and that was a very difficult process. And you know, he's obviously getting more and more nervous, more anxious as you're watching, you know, these different areas fall, and then you know that presence arrive to Kabul, right? And um, he was in contact with us, you know, daily, right? And multiple of us guys from that platoon were, uh, working the piece over here to try to get him out of there. Um, I was talking to politicians here. I was engaged with, the I think it was like immigration and maybe a DOS, as far as like um, uh, their offices for that specifically. Um, my friend Jake really led that um, whole effort largely, and we were able to ultimately get him out of there. But it wasn't until you know uh, after really the country fell, and so that was difficult from multiple aspects, and I was very concerned for him, and his well being.
I'm really glad to hear that, man. You hear a lot about, some of the allies that we worked with over there. Like the commandos, a lot of those dudes getting left behind. Some of the Katekos, the KKA dudes, those guys getting left behind as well. So it's always, it's a good thing to hear about the guys that did make it out.
Yeah,
Kind of going in a little bit more on that. I know this is more on the political strategic side of things, but how viable do you think a small, counterterrorism oriented element, could have been if you had a couple ODAs stay there, had a couple Ranger platoons stay there, and or do you think it was right for us to get out when we did?
man. I mean, I think obviously this is all like my personal opinion. It doesn't reflect on the DoD or anything of that nature, right? But um, you know, I I ask myself sometimes if we needed to be there as long as we were. If there was maybe other earlier times that would have been better, right? In some ways to leave there. Um, I I would say my big takeaway really is like, you know, what are the like what are the lessons that we can learn from that? Not just from like the tactical standpoint, but like overall, right? And I see some of my peers, both guys who had deployments there and people who did not, kind of saying, being kind of dismissive of it and saying, well, it was going to be bad no matter what. Um, and I think that's kind of a defeatist mentality. I don't really agree with that mentality. I think that you can always look at something like that and strive, you know, ask yourself how you can do it better next time. What would you change next time? What went well? What did we feel like went well from that? I will say that I think our ability to project power over there to get the aircraft in there that we did and have them turning and burning the way we did and pull people out of there, move assets and, um, you know, both and civilians and even some local nationals out of there. That's super impressive, man. Like that to me, like I will say that I was proud to see our ability to do that, to from like a major muscle movement logistical piece. I think that was impressive. um but I think you have to AAR every operation you do, right? And ask yourself, hey, what did we do well? Why did it go well? What maybe didn't go so well? And what can we do better next time to prevent that? And so that's kind of my feelings on that.
Fair enough, man. At this point, we can start getting into closing the podcast up a little bit and just, getting to reflections and lessons learned. And, if there's anything you feel like we failed to mention so far here, this is kind of your spot to go, talk about that a bit. Or, if you want to plug anything, a big focus of what we're trying to do with the podcast eventually is, stand something up in the way of getting proceeds out to veteran organizations.
Mhm.
But right now, if you have like an organization that you want to plug, maybe one that's helped you out in the past, helped out buddies, something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I do want to touch on is like, for the guys who maybe are struggling with, the way Afghanistan played out, right? Or maybe their role there. If they're having issues with that, or really whatever, anything as it relates to this sort of thing, if they hit you up, um, please give them my contact information, right? And we can talk as much as they need or want to talk. But I will say that for those guys, like, because I have seen a fair amount of guys who are like struggling with that, right?
Hmm.
And man, like, I think I feel like that they can and should take pride in the work that they did there, because from our level on that tactical piece, man, like we went out like as a force, not just like the guys I was with, but obviously like as a force. I think generally speaking, we went out and we earned that paycheck every day, and we went out and fulfilled our role, that tactical piece, right? So I don't think that they should hold themselves accountable or maybe regret for that. The way things played out, that's not on you, man. You did what you were expected to do. You did what you're obligated to do. And um, you fulfilled your end of the bargain. So I think that deserves respect. I think that, and they should take pride in that. So yeah, if any of those guys are having a hard time, they can absolutely hit me up. Or if they just want to shoot the shit, whatever. Uh, I will say that something that has become, as I've, been around for a while and gotten more, um, I guess, senior in my career, or maybe had like my own issues, right? I think there's several facets of your healthcare, your well-being, whatever, that you have a lot of wear and tear on your body, your mind, whatever, from doing this stuff for a deployment, multiple deployments, multiple years, and so if guys want to talk about maybe hey, I have like a TBI and I never really got seen for that, and I'm having issues now, or or hey, like I feel like I'm having issues, I feel like I might have low testosterone, or hey, I'm having sleep issues. They can definitely hit me up too. A lot of those things look very similar, a lot of them overlap. There is a awesome program called UNC Thrive, THRIVE.
Hmm.
That's for veterans specifically, not active duty. Active duty has its own stuff, like NICO and uh,
Intrepid
Intrepid
Spirit.
Spirit.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah, man. So, but Thrive is for those guys who maybe aren't on active duty anymore and do have those issues and think it's seen for them. And it's kind of like a multifaceted treatment approach. And from my understanding, you're not coming out of pocket on that. So if I'm plugging anything, I would say that for sure. And then generally, hey man, if you have that training or those experiences, I think something that we run into as a force a lot, and maybe this is coming from some of the stuff I just lectures I just sat on this conference I went to last week. But hey man, and if you have knowledge, TTPs, etc., that you gleaned from your training or your experiences, please pass that on to the next generation. Even if you're out now, get on Reddit, hit up, um, the DoD itself or DA, but please share those experiences, because I think a lot of us as a force, you kind of have these peaks and valleys, and there's a lot of, after every conflict, we lose a lot of those lessons learned. So I would love to see more guys kind of share that and pass that along to the next generation and set them up for success.
Yeah, absolutely, man, and it's really good to hear you speak about that. I know just from my experiences with you offline, I know you're very open about talking about burnout and mental health. So yeah, definitely we can definitely facilitate that. So final question before we wrap things up. Going back to being at 30th AG, being that scared 18-year-old kid, looking back on your career, would you do it again? Are there significant changes that you would make, or would you still kind of follow the same model of, what's gotten you through the army, what's gotten you to life up until this point?
Yeah, man. I don't think I would change a thing. I mean, maybe I would have been more insistent with that, Ranger liaison at Airborne school. But in general, man, I am extremely grateful for the experiences and the training that have kind of come my way. And then, uh, this maybe sounds cheesy or cliche, but I'm grateful, to the Army for getting me out of kind of the road that I was headed down, as a teenager, and giving me a path and giving me a skill set, whether you decide to do one enlistment or do 20 or even more. I think that that can be very beneficial for guys like me, right? And girls like me, who are in that similar shoes, right? Those similar shoes. Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, I was a very scared 18-year-old kid, but, or I would say uncertain, right? But as I said earlier, have been extremely fortunate for the experiences that have come my way, and I wouldn't change a thing. My only regret is that I couldn't do more. So
Cool, man. So it's been really, really good having you on. I really appreciate you coming on and talking to us. I feel like it's been a really good conversation. You're always welcome to come back on, if you feel like we've missed anything or if there's anything else you want to talk about. So that invitation's always there.
hey, thanks, brother. I appreciate it. I appreciate you guys doing this for sure, and helping tell our stories. Um, and I think a lot of, I mean, I've listened to previous episodes. I think that there are a lot of stories that deserve to be told and heard, right? And I'm glad that I could be a part of that. I appreciate you having me on. Yeah, man. If you ever want to do this again, just hit me up for sure.